There is a door inside the Tower of London that has not been opened for the public in over 100 years. Yeoman warders, the men and women who live inside the tower walls, will gladly tell you about the ravens, about the ghost of Anne Boleyn walking the green with her head under her arm. But ask about the lower levels, beneath the old powder magazines and the Norman foundations, and the easy charm drops. Some say they are not allowed to discuss it. Others say they have never been down there in 30 years of service, and they say it in a tone that suggests this is not an accident. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe, and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it. It sits below the level where the tourists walk, past a rope that says staff only, behind a grill that has rusted shut in places where the river damp gets into the iron. The White Lady is said to look out from the windows of the bloody tower, but the rooms we are concerned with tonight do not appear in any ghost story, any guidebook, or any official tour. I take strange, half-forgotten corners of history, the kind that never quite make it into the school textbooks, and I lay them out slowly, piece by piece, so your mind has something gentle and curious to hold on to while the rest of you drifts off. Tonight we are going beneath one of the oldest fortresses in the world, into rooms that official guidebooks do not mention, sealed by order of people whose names you would recognize, for reasons that were never fully explained to the public. The Tower of London is nearly 1,000 years old. William the Conqueror began building the White Tower in the early 1070s, not long after he took the English crown at Hastings, and every monarch since has added something to the site. New walls, new towers, new chapels, new prisons. By the time you reach the 19th century, the tower is not one building at all. It is a small, walled city, layered over itself like sediment, with passages and chambers that even the people who work there cannot fully map. Historians who have spent entire careers studying the tower will admit, off the record, that there are sections of the substructure that have never been formally surveyed, not because no one is curious, because access has been refused, again and again, by the institutions that control it. This is the story of those rooms, what they might be, what the historical record hints at, in the gaps between official statements, what former staff have said when they thought no one was recording, and what it might mean that a building owned by the Crown, visited by millions of tourists every year, still keeps something locked away in the dark beneath its oldest stones. Let's start with what we actually know, because the foundation of any good mystery is the solid ground you stand on before the floor disappears. The White Tower itself sits on a low rise beside the Thames, chosen by the Normans because it gave them a clear line of sight over the river and over the Saxon city they had just conquered. When William's engineers began digging the foundations, they were not building on empty ground. Roman London, Londinium, had stood on this stretch of riverbank for thousands of years before the Normans arrived, and the Romans had built walls, bastions, and at least one fortified riverside structure roughly where the tower complex now sits. Archaeologists have confirmed fragments of Roman wall incorporated directly into the lower courses of the medieval defences, stones quarried and shaped by people who never heard of England, repurposed by builders who arrived 1,000 years later. This matters because it means that whatever the Normans built in the 11th century was never starting from nothing. They were building on top of layers that were already old, already complicated, already full of structures whose original purpose had been lost even to the people living in London at the time. When you dig a foundation into ground like that, you do not always know what you are going to find. Medieval builders kept records that have mostly not survived, written in Latin on parchment that has crumbled or burned or simply been thrown away over the long centuries since. But fragments do remain, scattered across monastic chronicles and royal account books, and a handful of them mention something that historians have argued about for over a century. References to chambers found during construction, not built by the Normans, already there. One of the most cited fragments comes from a monastic chronicle associated with Westminster, written perhaps 100 years after the White Tower's completion, describing workmen who, while deepening a well or a cellar near the foundations, broke through into a void beneath the rock. The text is frustratingly brief. It does not say what they found inside. It simply notes that the opening was filled in again on the order of the king's officers, and that the men involved were sworn to silence under threat of losing their hands. That detail, the threat of mutilation for talking about a hole in the ground, has fascinated historians for generations, because it is wildly disproportionate to anything as mundane as an old Roman cistern or a collapsed drain. You do not threaten skilled labourers with dismemberment over plumbing. You threaten them like that when the king's officers are afraid of what people might say if the story got out. We do not know what they found. That is the honest, frustrating truth, and anyone who tells you otherwise with total confidence is selling you something. But the pattern of secrecy did not end with the Normans. It is the thread that runs through almost every century of the tower's existence, and it is worth following carefully, because secrecy that persists for 900 years is not an accident. It is a policy. Move forward to the reign of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, a king obsessed with consolidating his power and his legitimacy through architecture as much as through war. Edward expanded the tower significantly, adding the outer curtain wall and reshaping much of the inner defences. During this expansion, royal account rolls, the actual financial ledgers kept by the crown's clerks, list payments to masons for work, described only as the sealing of the old chambers beneath the inner ward. Not the building of new chambers, the sealing of old ones. These ledgers are dry, bureaucratic documents, lists of wages and material costs, and they are not in the habit of inventing mysteries. When a clerk writes down a payment for sealing work, it is because sealing work happened, and someone needed to be paid for it, and someone above that clerk decided the expense was worth the king's money. What were they sealing, and why? The official explanation offered by some modern historians is structural. Older Norman and possibly Roman substructures may have been deemed unsafe, prone to collapse, and simply closed off as a matter of basic engineering caution. This is plausible. It is also incomplete, because structural sealing in the medieval period was usually done with rubble fill, a brute force solution that left no access at all. The account rolls from Edward's reign describe something different. They describe iron grills, lockable doors, a keeper appointed specifically to oversee access to these spaces, a position that, remarkably, persisted in some form for centuries afterward under different titles. You do not appoint a permanent keeper, a salaried royal officer whose entire job is controlling access to a space, if that space is simply an unsafe ruin you have filled with rubble. You appoint a keeper when the space still exists, still has a use, and still needs to be controlled. This is where the story usually splits into two paths, and I want to walk you down both of them honestly, because that is the only way to actually understand what we are dealing with here. The first path is the boring one, and I say that with affection, because boring explanations are usually correct. The Tower of London has been continuously occupied, modified, damaged by fire, rebuilt, and repurposed for nearly 1,000 years. Any building with that history accumulates closed-off spaces simply through the ordinary churn of construction. Cellars get filled in when their floors above are rebuilt. Passages get bricked up when a new wall needs support. Wells run dry and get capped. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires nothing more than the slow, unglamorous logic of maintenance across centuries. A great many of the sealed spaces beneath the tower almost certainly fall into this category. Mundane, structural, forgotten, not because anyone wanted them forgotten, but because nobody had a reason to remember them. The second path is the one that keeps historians arguing in academic journals and keeps documentary crews showing up at the tower's gates, asking for access they will not be granted. This path follows the office of the keeper, the position created under Edward I and maintained in various forms through subsequent reigns, and it asks a simple question. If the sealed chambers were merely structural hazards, why would anyone need a dedicated officer to manage access to them, generation after generation, monarch after monarch, for centuries? The records around this office are thin, deliberately so in some cases, because the keeper's duties were often folded into broader titles like Constable of the Tower or Lieutenant of the Tower, roles that carried enormous prestige and were typically given to the monarch's most trusted nobles. But within the personal papers of several constables, papers that have survived in fragments scattered across the British Library and a handful of private family archives, there are references to something called, in various spellings across various centuries, the deep-keeping or the under-keeping. Not a grand title. A quiet, almost bureaucratic phrase, the kind of language people use when they want a sensitive responsibility to sound as unremarkable as possible. By the time you reach the Tudor period, the documentation becomes slightly richer because the Tudors were obsessive record keepers, and Henry VIII in particular ran an administration that loved paperwork almost as much as it loved executions. During Henry's reign, the tower underwent significant renovation, partly to modernize its defenses against the new reality of cannon warfare, and partly because Henry used the tower extensively as both fortress and prison, and he wanted it to reflect his power. Renovation records from this period mention, in a handful of surviving documents, payments for work on what is described as the Old Vault beneath the White Tower, work that involved reinforcing certain walls while explicitly leaving others undisturbed. The phrase used, translated from the original administrative English of the period, is striking. The masons were instructed to strengthen the outer chamber and to leave the inner door as found, sealed, and untouched, per the order of the king's own hand. Per the order of the king's own hand, not per the order of the constable, not per the standard practice of the Office of Works, the government body that managed royal building projects. Henry VIII himself, a king who involved himself personally in matters of theology, foreign policy, military strategy, and the fates of two wives he sent to the executioner, also apparently involved himself personally in the decision to leave a particular door beneath the White Tower sealed. Kings do not personally intervene in maintenance decisions about empty rooms. They intervene in decisions that matter to them, for reasons that matter enough to put their name on it. We do not know what was behind that door in 1536, the year these renovation records are dated. We do know that 1536 was an extraordinarily turbulent year, even by Henry's standards. It was the year Anne Boleyn was executed within the tower walls. It was the year the dissolution of the monasteries began in earnest, a process that saw the crown seize an almost unimaginable quantity of monastic wealth, relics, manuscripts, and treasure from religious houses across England. Historians have long noted that a portion of this seized material was never publicly accounted for. Inventories exist for what was sold, melted down, or redistributed to loyal nobles. But gaps exist in those inventories too. Items listed as received into the tower's keeping that simply do not appear again in any subsequent record. Where did they go? The honest academic answer is that record keeping in the 16th century was imperfect, and items were probably lost to ordinary administrative sloppiness, theft, or simple decay. But it is also true that the Tower of London, in 1536, possessed both the motive and the physical means to make things disappear into spaces that no one outside a tiny circle of trusted royal officers was permitted to enter. Now let's go back further, before Henry, before the Tudors entirely, to a mystery that most people listening to this already know at least the surface of, because it has been retold in plays, novels, and documentaries for over 500 years. The Princes in the Tower. In 1483, two boys, Edward V, the 12-year-old heir to the English throne, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were lodged in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been appointed Lord Protector following the sudden death of their father, Edward IV. The official explanation given at the time was that the boys were being housed in royal apartments ahead of Edward's coronation, a perfectly normal practice, since the tower had served as a royal residence as well as a fortress for centuries. Within months, Richard of Gloucester had himself declared king, taking the throne as Richard III on the legal grounds that his nephews were illegitimate. The boys were seen playing in the Tower Gardens through the summer of 1483. By the autumn, the sightings stopped. They were never seen again, and their fate remains, to this day, one of the most debated unsolved mysteries in English history. The traditional account, popularized by Tudor historians writing under a dynasty that had every political incentive to blacken Richard III's reputation, holds that the boys were murdered on Richard's orders, smothered in their sleep, and buried somewhere within the tower grounds. In 1674, workmen renovating the staircase of the White Tower discovered a wooden box containing two small human skeletons, buried roughly 10 feet beneath the foundations. King Charles II, accepting the popular identification of these remains as the lost princes, ordered them interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren. The skeletons have never been definitively forensically confirmed as belonging to the princes. and the Crown has, on more than one occasion in the centuries since, declined requests from historians and scientists to allow modern DNA testing on the remains. Buckingham Palace and the relevant ecclesiastical authorities have generally cited respect for the dead and the sanctity of royal burial as the reason for refusal. Here is where the story connects to what we have been discussing. The 1674 discovery was not an isolated event. The workmen who found the box were engaged in a larger renovation project that involved, according to surviving Office of Works correspondence, the clearing and reinforcement of several substructure passages beneath the White Tower's main staircase, passages that connect, according to later 19th century surveys, to a wider network of sub-level chambers running beneath the entire central keep. The official narrative focuses entirely on the box of bones, understandably, because it is the dramatic and emotionally resonant detail. But the broader renovation project, the one that led the workmen to that specific spot 10 feet down, has received far less attention, and what little documentation survives about it includes a curious note. The same Office of Works correspondence mentions that several of the passages uncovered during this renovation were, after the discovery of the remains, resealed rather than incorporated into the ongoing building work, and that this resealing was carried out under direct instruction rather than as a matter of routine practice. In other words, the discovery of what may have been the bones of two murdered princes did not lead to a fuller excavation of the surrounding chambers to learn more about what else might be down there. It led to those chambers being closed up again, quickly, deliberately, and the matter was considered settled. Whether this was simple 17th century squeamishness about disturbing what was assumed to be a royal gravesite, or something more deliberate, is a question that no surviving document answers directly. But it fits the pattern we have already traced across 4 centuries of Tower history. Something is found. Something is recorded in the barest possible terms. And then the door closes again, this time for good, or at least for as long as anyone currently alive has been able to determine. Let's move to a part of the tower that almost everyone who visits actually sees, at least the visible part of it, because it gives us a useful window into how the institution thinks about what should and should not be shown to the public. The crown jewels. Today, the crown jewels are displayed in the Jewel House, a purpose-built exhibition space constructed in the 20th century specifically to manage the enormous crowds who come to see the imperial state crown, the sovereign scepter, and the rest of the regalia used in coronations. It is bright, modern, heavily monitored, and entirely above ground. This was not always the case. For most of the tower's history, the crown jewels were kept in the Martin Tower, a much older and more modest structure on the northeast corner of the inner ward, and the security arrangements around them were, by any modern standard, almost laughably casual for an institution holding objects of such immense value. This casualness is what made possible one of the most audacious crimes in British history, the attempted theft of the crown jewels in 1671 by a man named Colonel Thomas Blood. Blood, an Irish adventurer with a long history of conspiracy and rebellion against the English crown, spent months ingratiating himself with the elderly jewel housekeeper, a man named Talbot Edwards, eventually convincing Edwards to show him and his accomplices the jewels under the pretense of arranging a marriage between Blood's fictitious nephew and Edwards's daughter. Once inside, Blood and his men overpowered Edwards, flattened the imperial state crown with a mallet to hide it under a cloak, sawed the scepter in half to make it easier to conceal, and very nearly escaped with the entire collection before being caught at the tower's outer gate. The official histories treat this as a story of audacity and near miss, and it certainly is that. But the incident also forced the Crown to seriously reconsider how the Jewel House and the broader tower complex managed access to its most sensitive holdings, and the resulting security review, conducted under Charles II in the years immediately following the Blood incident, produced a set of recommendations that have never been fully published. We know they exist because they are referenced, in passing, in later administrative correspondence from the early 18th century, correspondence that mentions implementing additional measures as recommended in the report following the Blood affair. What were those measures? Some are obvious and well documented: improved locks, additional guards, a more formal process for granting visitor access. But the correspondence also references something called the lower repository, a term that does not appear in any earlier tower documentation and which seems to emerge specifically out of this post-Blood security overhaul. The lower repository is mentioned exactly 4 times across surviving 18th century tower administrative records, and never with any explanation of what it physically was or where exactly it was located. Each mention is purely administrative: a note about a key being issued, a note about an inspection being conducted, a note about a piece of furniture being moved into or out of it. The language treats the reader as someone who already knows what the lower repository is and does not need it explained, which tells us that whatever it was common enough knowledge among the small circle of people who managed the tower's day-to-day operations that it required no introduction. And yet, in the more than 250 years since these mentions, no surviving document explicitly states what the lower repository contained, why it was created in direct response to a jewel theft, or what eventually happened to it. It simply stops being mentioned after the 1740s, vanishing from the written record as completely as if it had never existed at all, which is itself unusual, because institutions rarely just stop mentioning a functioning facility without some kind of closing record, a final inventory, a note about decommissioning, anything. One persistent theory, advanced by a handful of independent researchers who have spent years combing through tower archives held at the National Archives in Kew, suggests that the lower repository was not a storage space for jewels at all, but rather a reinforced holding area built into the existing network of sealed sub-level chambers we have already discussed, repurposed after the Blood incident specifically because it already existed, already had controlled access, and did not require new construction that might draw unwanted attention. If this theory holds, it would mean the 18th century crown was not creating new secrets beneath the tower. It was simply finding new uses for old ones. Let's talk about the animals for a moment, because this part of the story surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, and it gives us another thread that leads, eventually, back underground. For roughly 600 years, from the early 13th century until 1835, the Tower of London housed a royal menagerie, a private zoo maintained by successive English monarchs, stocked over the centuries with lions, leopards, an elephant gifted by the King of France, a polar bear that was allowed, astonishingly, to swim and fish in the Thames on a long chain, and at various points, kangaroos, ostriches, and a baboon. This menagerie was not a minor curiosity. It was a significant royal institution, a status symbol meant to demonstrate the reach of English diplomacy and the wealth of the crown, since exotic animals were typically acquired as diplomatic gifts from foreign rulers eager to curry favor with the English throne. Housing dangerous animals within a fortress that also held prisoners, the crown jewels, and the royal armories required serious infrastructure, and a portion of that infrastructure was, predictably, underground. Animal pits, holding cells, and what period records describe as cooling vaults, spaces dug below ground level to keep animals comfortable during hot summers, were constructed at various points across the menagerie's long history. When the menagerie was finally closed in 1835, with most of the surviving animals transferred to the newly established London Zoo in Regent's Park, the Tower authorities faced a significant practical problem. What do you do with several centuries' worth of accumulated animal infrastructure, much of it underground, much of it no longer needed for anything? The answer, according to surviving Office of Works correspondence from the 1830s, was a combination of demolition and sealing, broadly consistent with how the tower had always handled obsolete underground spaces. But one detail from this period stands out, because it comes not from official correspondence, but from the private diary of a junior clerk employed by the Office of Works, a diary that survived by pure accident, donated to a regional archive by the clerk's descendants in the 20th century, with no awareness of its significance. The clerk, whose name was Josiah Pemberton, was assigned in 1835 to assist with documenting the menagerie closure, a fairly mundane administrative task. His diary entries from this period are largely unremarkable: complaints about the weather, notes about his lodgings, the ordinary texture of a young clerk's working life in early Victorian London. But one entry, dated to the autumn of 1835, describes something unusual. Pemberton writes that while assisting senior surveyors in assessing the old animal pits for demolition, The work crew broke through a wall that was not part of the menagerie structure at all, but appeared to be considerably older, constructed from a different style of masonry that one of the senior surveyors, a man Pemberton refers to only as Mr. Halloway, immediately identified as predating the Tudor period and possibly considerably older than that. Pemberton describes Halloway's reaction as one of visible alarm rather than scholarly excitement, which is itself notable, because an antiquarian discovery of this kind would typically have been a source of professional delight for a surveyor in this period, an era when interest in England's medieval and ancient past was growing rapidly among educated Victorians. Instead, according to Pemberton's account, Halloway ordered the work crew to stop immediately, sent Pemberton to fetch the tower's resident governor, and the opening was, within a matter of hours, bricked back up under the governor's personal supervision before any further investigation took place. Pemberton's diary entry ends with a line that has been quoted in several books about tower mysteries published over the past few decades, though always without full context, because the diary itself remained largely unknown to researchers until relatively recently. The line reads, in Pemberton's own slightly old-fashioned phrasing, that Mr. Halloway said to him quietly, as they walked back across the inner ward, that some doors at the tower had stayed shut for a reason longer than any man now living could properly explain, and that a wise clerk learned not to ask after such reasons if he wished to keep his position. The 1850s brought a wave of infrastructure modernization across London, driven largely by public health concerns following repeated cholera outbreaks that were eventually, correctly, traced to contaminated water sources rather than the prevailing theory of bad air. Sir Joseph Bazalgette's famous sewer system, one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian era, required surveying and, in some cases, rerouting older drainage and water systems across the city, including those beneath and around the Tower of London, which sat directly on the Thames and had its own centuries-old system of moats, drains, and water management infrastructure dating back to the medieval period. This surveying work, conducted by engineers under contract to the Metropolitan Board of Works rather than the tower's own internal administration, produced something the earlier Office of Works Records never did, an outside perspective from people who did not have generations of institutional habit, telling them which questions not to ask. The surviving survey reports, held today in the London Metropolitan Archives, include a section dealing specifically with the tower's substructure, and the engineer who authored this section, a man named Frederick Ashworth, wrote with the blunt confusion of someone encountering something that did not match his expectations. Ashworth's report notes that his survey team, while mapping the old moat drainage channels on the eastern side of the complex, identified what he describes as an extensive network of passages running beneath the inner ward at a depth considerably below the water table, passages that, in his professional engineering opinion, served no discernible drainage function and appeared to predate the moat system entirely. He requested permission from tower authorities to conduct a fuller survey of this network, explicitly framing his request in terms of public safety, arguing that unknown void spaces beneath a structure undergoing modernization posed a genuine structural risk that the Metropolitan Board of Works had a professional obligation to assess. His request was denied. The denial came not from the tower's resident governor, who Ashworth's correspondence suggests was actually sympathetic to the safety argument, but from a much higher level of government, a brief letter preserved in the same archive collection, written on behalf of the constable of the tower, stating only that the passages in question fell under the jurisdiction of the royal household and that further survey work was, in the language of the period, not deemed necessary nor desirable. Ashworth's own marginal notes on his copy of this letter, visible in the archived original, express clear professional frustration, with one note simply reading, in his own handwriting, "Then why ask me to survey at all, if not to learn what is there?" His final report to the Metropolitan Board of Works recommends, for the official record, that the passages be considered structurally sound, based on incomplete data, a recommendation he was, by his own private correspondence with a colleague that has also survived, deeply uncomfortable making, because incomplete data is not the same thing as sound data, and Ashworth knew it. This pattern, an outside professional encountering the sealed network, requesting access for entirely legitimate and bureaucratically defensible reasons, and being refused by an authority above the tower's own day-to-day management, recurs with remarkable consistency across the documented history of the site. It is not the pattern of a building that has simply accumulated forgotten cellars. It is the pattern of an institution that has decided, at some level far above ordinary administration, that whatever lies in those specific spaces is not for outside eyes, regardless of how reasonable the request to look might be. Now let's jump forward to the 20th century, to a period when the Tower of London once again became militarily significant in a way it had not been for centuries, and when its underground spaces took on a new and very real practical urgency. During the Second World War, London endured the Blitz, the sustained German bombing campaign that killed tens of thousands of civilians and devastated huge sections of the city between 1940 and 1941. Every significant building in London with usable underground space pressed that space into service as air raid shelter, and the Tower of London, with its centuries of accumulated sub-level construction, was no exception. Official records from this period, considerably more complete than anything from earlier centuries, thanks to the modern bureaucratic habits of 20th century government, confirm that several of the tower's known underground chambers, the ones already in regular use for storage and administration, were converted for use as shelter space for the small permanent staff and military garrison who continued to live and work within the walls throughout the war. What is less commonly discussed, because it does not fit neatly into the tower's official wartime narrative of stoic British resilience, is the brief but well-documented imprisonment of Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's deputy, who flew alone to Scotland in May of 1941 in a bizarre and still not fully explained attempt to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. Hess was the last state prisoner ever held at the Tower of London, continuing a tradition of royal and political imprisonment that stretched back to the tower's earliest medieval origins, and his brief confinement there, lasting only a few days before he was transferred to more permanent facilities elsewhere, generated a flurry of security planning that has only been partially declassified even now, more than 80 years later. The portions of this planning that have been released through Freedom of Information requests over the past 2 decades reveal that British military intelligence took the security of Hess's brief tower imprisonment with extraordinary seriousness, treating him as a potential target for both German rescue attempts and assassination by parties who might want him silenced before he could reveal whatever information he carried about the internal politics of the Nazi leadership. Security planning documents from this period reference, in passing, a contingency option involving what is described only as the lower holding area as a fallback location in the event the primary cell was deemed compromised, a phrase that appears nowhere else in any surviving wartime tower documentation and which several researchers have connected, speculatively but not unreasonably, to the same network of sealed sub-level chambers that runs through every other chapter of this story. If this connection is accurate, it would mean that as recently as 1941, within living memory of people who are still alive today, the British government was treating the sealed network beneath the Tower of London as a viable, functional space, secure enough to be considered as an emergency holding location for one of the most sensitive prisoners of the entire war. That is a very different picture from a forgotten ruin or a structurally unsound hazard sealed off out of an abundance of caution. That is the description of infrastructure that someone at the highest levels of British military intelligence knew to still be usable, accessible, and secure enough to trust with an asset of extraordinary geopolitical importance. Hess himself, in memoirs and interviews conducted decades later during his long subsequent imprisonment at Spandau prison in Berlin, made only one oblique reference to his brief time at the Tower of London, telling an interviewer that the British had shown him, in his words, more of their old fortress than he expected to see, and that he had been left with the impression, intentional or not, that the British wished him to understand the depth and antiquity of what he was dealing with. Hess was, by most historical accounts, a man of fragile and increasingly unstable mental state by this point in his life, and his statements in later life should be read with appropriate skepticism. But the phrase has nonetheless become a small but persistent thread in the broader tapestry of tower mysteries, repeated in books and documentaries about the site for decades since, always presented with the appropriate caveat that we cannot know exactly what he meant, but always repeated nonetheless, because it fits so neatly into everything else we have already traced. Let's move into more recent history now, into the era of professional archaeology as we would recognize it today, with proper stratigraphic recording, radiocarbon dating, and academic peer review, because this is where the story takes its most concrete and well-documented turn, and where the official record itself, not speculation about lost diaries or fragmentary medieval chronicles, confirms that something unusual happened. In 1977, in preparation for renovations to mark the Queen's Silver Jubilee, historic royal palaces, the organisation that has managed the Tower of London on behalf of the Crown since the 1980s, though at the time the responsibility sat with a predecessor government department, commissioned a comprehensive archaeological survey of the Tower complex, the most thorough such survey ever attempted up to that point. The survey was led by a respected academic archaeologist whose name appears in the published academic literature of the period, and his team made extensive use of newly available ground-penetrating technology, still relatively primitive by modern standards, but far more capable than anything available to Frederick Ashworth in the 1850s, to map void spaces beneath the inner ward without the need for invasive digging. The published results of this survey, which appeared in a limited academic circulation report and later in a more accessible form in a journal article from the early 1980s, confirmed the existence of an extensive network of sub-level chambers and passages beneath the central keep, dating across multiple historical periods, exactly as the documentary record across the previous 900 years had suggested. The published report describes this network in careful, measured academic language, noting structural features consistent with Norman, possibly Roman, and several intervening medieval construction phases. It is, on its surface, exactly the kind of dry, technical document you would expect from a serious archaeological survey. What makes this report significant is not what it says, but what independent researchers have since discovered by comparing it to the original unpublished field notes and survey data, portions of which were obtained decades later through a Freedom of Information request filed by a historian researching an unrelated topic who stumbled across the discrepancy almost by accident and later wrote about it in an academic blog post that received relatively little attention at the time but has since been cited repeatedly in books and documentaries covering Tower mysteries. The unpublished field notes describe several additional chambers located at a depth significantly below the rest of the surveyed network that do not appear at all in the final published report. The field notes describe these chambers only in the most technical terms, noting their approximate dimensions and depth, but include a margin annotation in what appears to be the lead archaeologist's own handwriting, stating that access to this specific section was restricted by the commissioning authority before full documentation could be completed, and that the team was instructed to exclude this section from the published findings. This is, as far as independent researchers have been able to determine, the single clearest piece of documentary evidence in the entire 900-year history of the Tower of London confirming that a professional, government-commissioned, peer-reviewed archaeological survey identified specific sealed chambers beneath the site, attempted to document them using modern scientific methods, and was explicitly instructed by an authority above the survey team to stop and to exclude the findings from public publication. It is not a medieval chronicle subject to translation difficulties and centuries of copying errors. It is not a Victorian clerk's private diary that might be exaggerating for dramatic effect. It is a 20th century academic field note, written by a credentialed professional archaeologist, describing in plain language an instruction to stop investigating and to keep what little had been found out of the published record. The archaeologist in question, who continued his academic career for decades afterward and published extensively on other aspects of medieval English fortification, never publicly discussed this specific incident in any interview or publication that researchers have been able to locate, and he passed away in the early 2000s without, as far as anyone has determined, ever breaking whatever agreement or instruction kept him from elaborating further. Whether this silence reflects a formal confidentiality agreement, a more informal, professional understanding, about which doors not to push on if you wanted to continue working with historic royal palaces and similar institutions in the future, or simply a personal decision that the matter was not worth the professional risk of pursuing further, is something we cannot know for certain. But the field notes exist, the annotation exists, and the gap between what was found and what was published exists, documented, dated, and verifiable by anyone willing to file the same Freedom of Information request and compare the two documents side by side. This brings us to the people who actually live and work at the tower today, because documents and field notes can only tell us so much, and the most compelling testimony about the tower's sealed spaces does not come from archives at all. It comes from the yeoman warders themselves, the ceremonial guardians of the tower who, unlike most museum staff, actually reside within the walls with their families, raising children in apartments built into the same medieval structure that housed prisoners and kings centuries ago. The yeoman warders are a tight-knit community, all former senior members of the British Armed Forces with at least 22 years of exemplary service, and the role comes with a culture of discretion that extends well beyond the cheerful, joke-filled tours they give to tourists during the day. Several retired warders have, over the years, given interviews to journalists and documentary researchers in which they discuss aspects of life within the tower that do not typically make it into official guidebooks, and a recurring theme across multiple, entirely independent interviews conducted years apart by different researchers who do not appear to have been in contact with each other is a shared reluctance to discuss the lower levels of the complex in any detail. One retired warder, speaking to a researcher compiling an oral history project about tower life in the early 2000s, described being told during his initial induction, decades earlier, that certain areas of the substructure were, in his words, simply not part of a yeoman warder's world, and that questions about them were gently but firmly discouraged by more senior colleagues. He described this not as an explicit rule written down anywhere, but as an unspoken cultural understanding, the kind of thing every new member of a small, close community learns within their first few months without ever being told directly, absorbed instead through the subtle social cues of more experienced colleagues, changing the subject, or simply not answering certain questions with their usual easy humor. Another former warder, in a separate interview conducted for a different project entirely, recalled a specific incident from sometime in the 1990s, when a contractor working on plumbing repairs somewhere in the vicinity of the White Tower's foundations reportedly encountered an obstruction that, according to the warder's second-hand account, the contractor described to colleagues afterward as an old door, not part of the modern plumbing system, that the senior tower staff overseeing the work insisted be left entirely alone and worked around rather than removed or even opened for inspection. The warder relaying this story was careful to note that he had not witnessed the incident himself, only heard about it from colleagues at the time, and that he could not vouch for every detail. This kind of careful second-hand hedging is common across almost all of the oral testimony researchers have gathered on this subject, which is itself worth noting, because it suggests that even among the people who actually live inside the tower walls, direct first-hand knowledge of the sealed network is rare, carefully compartmentalized, and shared only reluctantly even within the community. A third account, perhaps the most striking, comes from a yeoman warder's spouse, interviewed anonymously for a piece of long-form journalism published in a British newspaper's weekend magazine roughly 15 years ago. She described raising her children within the tower walls for over a decade, a genuinely unusual childhood by any standard, and recalled that her own children, like most children raised at the tower, absorbed certain unspoken rules about the complex without ever being given a formal explanation. She specifically mentioned an area near one of the lesser visited towers where her children, even as young as 5 or 6 years old, simply knew not to play, despite there being no visible barrier, warning sign, or obvious reason for an adult to forbid it. When she eventually asked her husband why their children avoided that particular spot so consistently, he reportedly told her only that the older warder families had always discouraged it, going back as long as anyone could remember, and that he himself did not know the original reason, only that the custom had clearly been passed down, parent to child, for at least 2 or 3 generations of tower families, an oral tradition of avoidance with no remembered origin, which is its own kind of evidence, the sociological equivalent of a fossil, a behavior pattern preserved long after the original cause, has been forgotten by everyone still practicing it. So, what is actually down there? Let's walk through the major theories, fairly and carefully, because the honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle actually knows for certain, and anyone who tells you they have the complete answer is almost certainly speculating well past what the evidence supports. But the evidence does support several serious possibilities, each with its own logic, and each worth taking seriously on its own terms. The first and most mundane theory is the one most professional historians lean toward when pressed, and it deserves to be stated plainly before we get into the more dramatic possibilities. The sealed chambers may simply be a combination of structurally compromised medieval and Roman remnants considered too dangerous and too expensive to properly excavate and stabilize, combined with sensitive but historically minor royal storage, perhaps documents, perhaps minor treasures, perhaps simply the kind of administrative paperwork that the royal household prefers to keep entirely private, as a matter of general institutional discretion, rather than because of any single dramatic secret. Under this theory, the centuries of secrecy are explained not by one grand conspiracy, but by an accumulated, self-reinforcing institutional habit where each generation of tower administrators simply continued the practice of restricting access because their predecessors had, without anyone along the way, needing a single, unified, dramatic reason. Bureaucracies are very good at perpetuating secrecy through sheer institutional inertia, long after the original reason for that secrecy has become irrelevant or even forgotten entirely. This theory is almost certainly true for at least some portion of the sealed network, and it has the considerable advantage of not requiring anything particularly extraordinary to be true. The second theory, somewhat more provocative, centers on the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII and the unaccounted-for portions of monastic wealth we discussed earlier. Under this theory, the deepest and most carefully guarded sections of the tower's substructure may contain relics, manuscripts, and treasures seized from England's monasteries in the 1530s and 1540s that were never publicly redistributed, sold, or melted down, but instead were quietly absorbed into permanent, undisclosed royal possession. This would explain the personal involvement of Henry VIII in sealing instructions, since a king who had just broken from the authority of the Pope and seized the wealth of the English Church would have had powerful personal and political reasons to keep certain of the most sensitive or symbolically potent seized items entirely out of public knowledge, items whose continued existence in royal hands might have proven politically awkward or religiously controversial for centuries afterward, long after the immediate Reformation crisis had passed. The third theory, favored by researchers with a particular interest in the Princes in the Tower mystery, suggests that the sealed chambers near the White Tower's foundations may contain additional remains or evidence connected to the fate of Edward V and his brother, evidence that successive monarchs, beginning with the Tudor dynasty that benefited enormously from Richard III's blackened reputation, had every political incentive to keep permanently hidden rather than risk a more complete, scientifically rigorous investigation that might complicate the accepted historical narrative. This would help explain the Crown's continued multi-century reluctance to allow modern forensic testing on the 1,674 remains currently held at Westminster Abbey, a reluctance some critics have found difficult to fully explain, through respect for the dead alone, given that the Crown has permitted far more invasive scientific examination of other historical royal remains when it served institutional or scholarly interests to do so. A fourth theory, more speculative still but persistent across decades of alternative history writing, connects the tower's sealed chambers to the broader, much older tradition of treasure and relic concealment that runs through English folklore, suggesting that some portion of the network may contain materials connected to far older traditions, possibly pre-Christian, possibly tied to the layers of Roman and even pre-Roman activity on the site, that the documentary record only hints at through those frustratingly brief medieval chronicle references to voids discovered beneath the original Norman foundations. This theory is the hardest to substantiate through conventional documentary evidence precisely because, by its own logic, anything that old would predate the written record entirely, leaving us with nothing but inference, pattern, and the simple, stubborn fact that whatever the 11th century workmen found beneath the rock, they were frightened enough of it, or instructed firmly enough by people who were frightened of it, to seal it shut and threaten anyone who talked about it with the loss of their hands. It is worth being honest about where these four theories sit relative to each other in terms of evidentiary weight. The first, mundane bureaucratic secrecy compounded by genuine structural hazard, requires the least speculation and explains the most data with the simplest assumptions. The second and third theories, involving monastic treasure and the princes respectively, both connect to specific, well-documented historical events and specific, identifiable political motives for secrecy, which gives them more solid footing than pure speculation, even though neither can currently be confirmed. The fourth theory, while the most romantically compelling, currently rests on the thinnest evidentiary ground, built almost entirely from inference and the unexplained gaps in a documentary record that, by its very nature, cannot easily speak to anything that predates writing itself. In 2019, a British investigative journalist working for a national broadsheet attempted to do what no one had managed in nearly a century: mount a sustained, formal effort to obtain official confirmation of what lies beneath the tower's sealed sections, using the full weight of modern freedom of information law, which in theory obligates public institutions in Britain to disclose information unless a specific, legally defined exemption applies. Her investigation, which she later wrote about in a long-form piece that received modest attention at the time, but has since become something of a reference point for researchers interested in this topic, began straightforwardly enough. She filed a Freedom of Information request directly with historic royal palaces, asking for any existing surveys, structural reports, or documentation relating to sealed or restricted access areas beneath the Tower of London complex. The response she received, after the standard statutory delay, was a partial release, a handful of genuinely mundane documents relating to known maintenance issues in clearly identified, non-controversial areas, accompanied by a formal notice that certain requested material was being withheld under an exemption relating to national security and the safety of the royal household. This is, on its face, a perfectly legitimate use of the exemption framework built into British freedom of information law, which does allow public bodies to withhold information that could reasonably compromise security arrangements for the monarch and senior royal family members, an entirely sensible provision in a world where security threats to public figures are a genuine, ongoing concern. But the journalist, persistent and experienced in navigating the bureaucratic mechanisms of British government, noticed something that struck her as significant. The exemption cited was the same one typically used to protect information about current, active security arrangements, the kind of thing you would expect to be invoked to protect, say, details about the Queen's actual security detail or the specific protocols followed during a state visit. Using that same exemption to withhold historical structural surveys of sealed chambers, some of them potentially centuries old, struck her as an unusual stretch of the provision's intended purpose, and she filed a formal appeal challenging the exemption, arguing that historical structural information, regardless of how old or how sensitive the chambers themselves might be, did not obviously fall under an exemption designed to protect active, current security operations. Her appeal was reviewed and ultimately rejected by the Information Commissioner's Office, the independent body that adjudicates freedom of information disputes in Britain, but the rejection notice itself, which she published in full alongside her article, contains language that several legal commentators found notable at the time. The Commissioner's ruling states that while the specific exemption cited might appear, on a narrow reading, more suited to contemporary security matters, the Commissioner accepted historic royal palaces' argument that the physical security of certain sealed structural areas remained an active, ongoing concern regardless of the historical age of the chambers themselves, because the chambers continued to exist, continued to require physical security measures in the present day, and therefore fell legitimately within the scope of the exemption as written. In other words, the ruling effectively confirmed, in formal legal language issued by an independent government oversight body, that whatever lies beneath the sealed sections of the Tower of London is currently being actively secured in the present day as a matter that the British government considers relevant to ongoing security concerns. That is a remarkable thing for an official body to confirm, even inadvertently in the course of denying a journalist's appeal. It tells us, with about as much certainty as this kind of investigation ever achieves, that the secrecy is not merely a dusty historical habit nobody has bothered to update. It is a maintained, current, deliberately defended policy. It is worth briefly comparing the Tower of London's situation to how other significant royal properties in Britain handle questions of historical secrecy, because the contrast is instructive. Windsor Castle, the oldest continuously occupied royal residence in Europe, has its own long history of restricted areas, particularly around the private apartments still used by the royal family, but the justification offered for that restriction is straightforward, current, and uncontroversial. People live there. You do not get unrestricted public access to someone's actual home, royal or otherwise, and nobody finds that explanation suspicious, because it requires no speculation at all. Balmoral, the family's private Scottish estate, is not even technically a state-owned property in the same sense as the Tower, and its privacy is governed by ordinary property law rather than any special historical secrecy provision. The Tower of London is different, precisely because it is not a private residence. No member of the royal family lives there in any meaningful day-to-day sense. It is a publicly accessible museum and historic site, visited by millions of tourists annually, managed by a charitable organization with public reporting obligations, and yet it maintains, by the government's own legal admission in response to a formal appeal, an active security interest in sealed structural areas whose contents have never been disclosed. That distinction between ordinary residential privacy and active, current security classification applied to a public museum's own basement is the entire heart of why this mystery has persisted for so long and continues to attract serious attention from historians, journalists, and curious people like you, listening in the dark, wondering what could possibly still be down there after 900 years. Let's slow down for a moment and think about the physical architecture of concealment itself, because it tells its own quiet story, separate from any single document or testimony. The White Tower was designed, from its very first stones, with a deliberate logic of layered access. The ground floor housed storage and the most basic functions. The next level up held the Great Hall and the Chapel of St. John, spaces meant to be seen, to impress visitors, to project the power of the Norman conquest onto anyone permitted inside. The upper floors held the most private royal apartments, accessible only to a small circle. This is a building designed, at every level, to control exactly who sees what, a physical embodiment of medieval hierarchy carved directly into stone and stairway. What is less often discussed is that this same logic of controlled, layered access extends downward as well as upward, and arguably with even greater deliberateness, because while the upper floors needed to balance privacy with the practical necessity of royal life happening within them, the lower levels had no such constraint. Nobody needed to live in the sub-level chambers. Nobody needed daily practical access to them for the ordinary business of governing a kingdom. Any access at all, therefore, represents a deliberate choice, a decision that something down there was worth the effort and expense of building, maintaining, and securing across 9 centuries, even though the most practical engineering solution, the one any sensible medieval builder would default to, if a space served no ongoing purpose, would simply have been to fill it with rubble and stone and never think about it again. The fact that successive generations of builders, from the Normans through Edward I, through the Tudors, through the Stuarts, through the Victorians, through 20th century military planners, all chose maintenance and controlled access over the much simpler and cheaper option of permanent burial, tells you something important. It tells you that whatever logic governs these spaces has remained consistent enough, important enough, across nearly 1,000 years of dramatically different governments, religions, and royal dynasties, to keep being honored, generation after generation, by people who in almost every other respect had wildly different priorities and values from each other. This brings us, almost inevitably, to the Ravens, because no discussion of tower mysteries can really avoid them, and they connect to this theme of deliberate, maintained tradition in a way that is worth pausing on. The famous legend holds that should the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the crown will fall and Britain with it, a superstition supposedly dating back centuries, though the documented history of this specific belief is, as with so much else at the Tower, considerably murkier and more recent than the popular version suggests. What is verifiably true, regardless of the legend's actual age, is that the Tower has maintained a dedicated Raven Master, a yeoman warder specifically responsible for the care of a small flock of ravens, continuously, for well over a century, and that during the Second World War, when London's bird population was decimated by bombing and food shortages, Winston Churchill himself reportedly took a personal interest in ensuring the Tower's raven population was protected and replenished, treating what might seem like a quaint superstition with what witnesses described as genuine seriousness, not the indulgent humouring of a folk tradition, but something closer to actual concern. Why would a wartime prime minister, managing the literal survival of his nation against an existential military threat, spend any of his limited attention on the welfare of a small flock of birds at a medieval fortress? The standard explanation is morale, the symbolic importance of preserving continuity and tradition during a period of national crisis, and this is almost certainly the primary, sufficient explanation. But it sits within the same broader pattern we have traced throughout this entire story, a pattern of people in positions of genuine power, treating elements of the Tower's traditions, its rituals, its closed doors, its careful maintenance of things that look, from the outside, like they should not matter very much, with a level of seriousness that seems disproportionate to any purely practical or purely sentimental explanation. Perhaps it really is nothing more than the accumulated weight of tradition, the simple human tendency to keep doing things a certain way because that is how they have always been done, amplified across 9 centuries, until the original reasons are entirely lost and only the habit of seriousness remains. Or perhaps, in at least some of these cases, the seriousness persists because somewhere, in some carefully guarded corner of institutional memory, somebody still actually remembers why it matters, and has simply never been in a position, or never had a reason, to explain it to the rest of us. It helps, at this point, to widen the lens a little, because the Tower of London is not actually unique in this respect, and understanding how other ancient fortified sites across Europe have handled their own sealed and restricted spaces can tell us something useful about how seriously to take the Tower's particular silence. The Kremlin in Moscow, a fortress with a history nearly as long and nearly as politically turbulent as the Tower's own, maintains, by the open admission of Russian state authorities, an extensive network of underground passages and chambers beneath its walls, portions of which remain closed to any public access whatsoever and have never been fully surveyed even by Russian archaeologists working under government commission. Russian historians have written about a persistent oral tradition, dating back centuries, of tunnels connecting the crufter points across the city, used historically for everything from secret escape routes during sieges to the storage of treasury reserves during periods of war. Soviet-era authorities, despite their generally aggressive stance toward what they considered superstitious Tsarist tradition, nonetheless maintained the same restrictions on these spaces that the Tsars had, and post-Soviet Russian governments have continued the practice essentially unchanged, suggesting that whatever practical security logic originally justified the secrecy has simply outlived every single political system that has controlled the building, in much the same pattern we have already traced at the Tower of London across 9 centuries and several different ruling dynasties. The Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, originally built as a mausoleum for the Roman Emperor Hadrian and later converted into a papal fortress, contains a famous secret passage, the Passetto di Borgo, connecting the fortress directly to the Vatican, a passage whose existence was, for centuries, an open secret among the powerful, while remaining entirely unacknowledged in any official capacity, used at least once that we know of with certainty, when Pope Clement VII fled through it during the catastrophic sack of Rome in 1527. But beyond the now well-documented and publicly accessible Passetto, the fortress's lower levels, built directly into and around Hadrian's original 2nd century mausoleum structure, contain sections that remain closed to the millions of tourists who visit annually, officially due to structural concerns regarding the ancient Roman masonry, though Italian archaeologists who have pushed for fuller access over the decades have noted, in terms that will sound very familiar by now, that structural concern alone seems an insufficient explanation for the consistency and duration of the restriction. Edinburgh Castle, perched on its volcanic crag overlooking the Scottish capital, has its own well-known example, the so-called hidden chambers, sealed in the early 19th century. After extensive use as a French and Napoleonic-era prisoner of war facility, and only reopened to limited public access in the late 20th century, after decades during which their very existence was barely acknowledged in official castle literature. When they were finally reopened, what visitors found was, by most accounts, fairly mundane: the carved graffiti and crude furnishings left behind by prisoners held there over a century earlier, a poignant but not particularly mysterious historical artifact. This example is worth including, precisely because it cuts against the more dramatic theories. Sometimes a sealed chamber really is just a sealed chamber, closed for reasons that, once finally explained, turn out to be considerably less exciting than decades of rumor had suggested. It is a useful reminder to hold on to as we continue, because not every locked door in an old building hides a conspiracy, and the most intellectually honest approach to a mystery like the Tower of London's substructure is to hold space for the possibility that at least some portion of what remains sealed will, if it is ever finally opened, prove to be exactly as unremarkable as the Edinburgh chambers eventually turned out to be. But the Edinburgh comparison also highlights, by contrast, what makes the Tower of London genuinely unusual among its European peers. Edinburgh Castle's hidden chambers were eventually opened, documented, and incorporated into public history once the original reason for restriction, basic embarrassment perhaps, or simply changing institutional priorities, no longer applied. The Tower of London's deepest sealed sections have never received that treatment, not once, not even partially, across 900 years and dozens of changes in government, religion, and royal dynasty. Every other comparable European site we have discussed has, at some point, opened at least some portion of its restricted spaces to public knowledge once the original justification faded. The tower stands out specifically because its restriction has never faded. It has been actively renewed, generation after generation, decade after decade, right up through a 2019 Freedom of Information ruling issued within living memory of most people listening to this right now. Let's return to the Martin Tower specifically, because it deserves a closer look, given its history as the long-term home of the crown jewels before their move to the modern jewel house, and because it sits at the center of one of the more carefully researched modern investigations into this entire mystery. The Martin Tower was built during the reign of Henry III in the 13th century, originally as part of the broader fortification expansion that also produced much of the tower's outer defensive ring. For roughly 2 centuries, from the 1670s following the Blood Incident through to the 1840s, it served as the primary home of the crown jewels, a fact that made it, for much of that period, arguably the single most valuable few square meters of real estate in the entire British Isles, and unsurprisingly, the building's lower levels received particular attention during the various security overhauls we have already discussed, including the post-Blood reforms and the mysterious lower repository referenced in 18th century correspondence. A modern independent researcher named Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, an architectural historian who has spent over a decade specifically studying the structural evolution of the tower complex through publicly available planning and conservation documents, published a detailed academic paper in the mid-2010s examining the structural history of the Martin Tower specifically, using conservation reports that historic royal palaces is legally required to file with relevant heritage authorities whenever significant structural work is undertaken on a listed historic building. Reports that, crucially, are subject to considerably less discretionary withholding than the kind of internal archaeological survey we discussed earlier, because they fall under different, more rigorously enforced heritage protection legislation rather than the more flexible security exemptions available under Freedom of Information law. Dr. Hartwell's paper, written in careful, measured, academic prose entirely appropriate to its field, notes that conservation reports filed in connection with structural stabilization work undertaken on the Martin Tower in the early 1990s describe, in passing, the identification of a previously undocumented void space beneath the tower's existing basement level, accessed through what the report describes as an original 13th century doorway that had been deliberately blocked with later masonry, dated through mortar analysis to sometime in the late 17th century, a date that aligns almost exactly with the period of the post-blood security reforms and the first appearance of references to the lower repository in administrative correspondence. The conservation report, because it was filed for heritage protection rather than security purposes, could not legally avoid at least acknowledging the void space's existence, since heritage conservation law in Britain requires reasonably complete documentation of any significant structural features encountered during protected building work, regardless of how sensitive those features might be from a security perspective. What the report does not do, and what Dr. Hartwell's careful academic analysis is quick to note, as a significant gap, is describe what, if anything, was found inside the void space once it was identified, or whether the space was actually entered and inspected at all before being, once again, resealed as part of the stabilization work. The report's language on this point is carefully, almost suspiciously neutral, stating only that the void was assessed as structurally stable and was not incorporated into the ongoing works, a phrasing that Dr. Hartwell's paper notes could describe either a thorough internal inspection that simply was not detailed in the report for unrelated reasons, or a complete absence of any internal inspection whatsoever, conducted by people who, for whatever reason, had no interest in actually looking inside, before sealing it shut once more. Dr. Hartwell, to her considerable credit as a careful academic researcher, does not draw any dramatic conclusions from this gap in her published paper. She states plainly that the available documentary evidence does not allow for a confident determination of what the 1990s conservation team actually found, or whether they looked at all, and she explicitly cautions her academic readers against speculative interpretation beyond what the primary sources can support. This is exactly the right approach for a peer-reviewed academic paper, and it is worth holding onto as a model for how to think about this entire topic. But in subsequent interviews given after the paper's publication, interviews conducted in a less formal academic register where she allowed herself slightly more latitude for speculation, Dr. Hartwell has noted that in her professional experience, reviewing dozens of similar conservation reports across other historic British buildings over her career, this particular kind of vague, non-committal language around an identified void space is unusual, and that most comparable reports, when a previously unknown space is discovered during protected conservation work, tend to include at least some basic descriptive detail, dimensions, apparent age, visible contents, if any, purely as a matter of standard professional documentation practice, regardless of whether the space is ultimately deemed significant. The near-total absence of that standard descriptive detail in the Martin Tower report, she has suggested, is itself a meaningful data point, not proof of anything dramatic, but a genuine anomaly worth noting in a field where she has reviewed enough ordinary, unremarkable conservation reports to know what ordinary and unremarkable actually looks like on the page. Let's talk about the prisoners for a while. Because the tower's long history as a place of confinement for the politically inconvenient, the religiously condemned, and the simply unlucky leaves behind one of the richest and most human sources of evidence we have, carved directly into the stone itself by people who had nothing left to do with their remaining time but leave a mark. The walls of the Beauchamp Tower, where many high-status prisoners were held across the centuries, are covered in carvings, names, dates, coats of arms, religious inscriptions, and occasionally longer, more personal messages, left by men and women awaiting trial, execution, or simply the slow passage of an uncertain captivity. This graffiti has been extensively studied and is, for the most part, exactly what it appears to be: the desperate, human need to leave evidence of one's own existence carved into stone by people who feared, often correctly, that they would not survive to tell their own story any other way. Most of it is mundane in the way that all real human history is mundane, names and dates and brief prayers, the universal language of people facing their own mortality. But a small handful of these carvings have attracted particular scholarly attention because of their content, and one in particular, attributed through stylistic and contextual analysis to a prisoner held during the reign of Elizabeth I, though never definitively identified by name, includes a phrase that has been the subject of considerable academic debate. Carved into a stone block in a section of the Beauchamp Tower not typically included on the standard public tour route, the inscription, translated from a slightly archaic form of English, reads roughly as follows. Below this floor lies a colder room than mine, and what sleeps there sleeps better forgotten. Historians who specialize in Tudor-era prisoner graffiti have offered several competing interpretations of this phrase. The most straightforward reading treats it as simple, morbid prisoner humor, a dark joke about the dungeons being even worse than the relatively comfortable high-status cell this particular prisoner occupied, a sentiment that would have been entirely understandable given the genuinely brutal conditions of the tower's lower-level holding cells during this period. A second interpretation, favored by researchers more interested in the broader sealed chamber mystery, suggests the phrase may be a more literal, if deliberately oblique, reference to something the prisoner had either heard about or possibly glimpsed during their time in the tower, phrased carefully enough to avoid any direct accusation that might have brought further punishment down on them. Since prisoners awaiting the Queen's judgment had every reason to be extremely careful about what they committed to permanent, visible record, we cannot know with certainty which interpretation is correct, and reasonable historians disagree. But the inscription's continued presence on a wall not included on the standard tourist route is, in itself, a small and possibly meaningless detail, or possibly another thread in the same pattern, depending on how charitable you are feeling toward the more dramatic reading. Now to the moat, which brings us to one of the more grim and well-documented episodes, connecting the tower's underground spaces to public health history. By the early 19th century, the tower's medieval moat, originally designed as a defensive water barrier, had become an open cesspit, fed by sewage runoff from the surrounding city with essentially no proper drainage or circulation, a public health catastrophe sitting directly beside one of the most important buildings in the British Empire. In 1843, following years of complaints about the stench and growing scientific understanding of the connection between standing contaminated water and disease, the moat was finally drained completely and filled in, a massive engineering project that required extensive excavation around the entire perimeter of the inner walls. This excavation, naturally, brought workmen into direct contact with the foundations of the outer walls at a scale and intimacy that had not occurred since the original medieval construction centuries earlier, and surviving newspaper accounts from 1843, reported with the genuine sensationalism that Victorian journalism was famous for, describe several minor discoveries made during the draining process. Old weapons, human remains believed to be from the moat's long history as a place where bodies were occasionally disposed of during periods of plague or civil unrest, and, in at least one newspaper account from the Illustrated London News, a brief and tantalizingly vague mention of workmen encountering what the report describes only as an old passage running beneath the wall near the Devlin Tower on the eastern side of the complex, a passage the report notes was, after brief examination by tower officials, ordered closed and the excavation redirected around it rather than through it. This 1843 newspaper account is significant, specifically because it represents one of the very few times any reference to these sealed underground features appears in a contemporary public source rather than internal administrative correspondence or private diaries discovered decades or centuries later. It made it into print, however briefly and however quickly the story seems to have been dropped by subsequent editions of the same publication, suggesting that whatever interest it briefly generated among the Victorian reading public was not allowed to develop into anything more substantial, whether through a simple lack of follow-up, newsworthy material, or something more deliberately discouraged by Tower authorities concerned about a moment of unwanted public curiosity at a politically sensitive site during a period of significant social unrest across Britain more broadly. It is worth pausing here to talk about the Constable of the Tower, a position that still exists today, appointed directly by the reigning monarch, and which has, across its very long history, served as the single thread of continuity running through every century we have discussed so far. The constable is, by tradition, one of the very few people who holds what might be called complete institutional knowledge of the Tower complex, a position of such ceremonial and historical weight that it is typically given, in the modern era, to a senior retired military officer of considerable distinction, often a former chief of the defense staff, as a kind of capstone honor at the end of a long and distinguished career of national service. The current and recent past holders of this position have, when interviewed about their role, spoken extensively and warmly about the ceremonial duties, the ravens, the history, the pageantry, the genuine privilege of being entrusted with stewardship of a building that has stood at the center of English history for nearly a millennium. None, as far as any published interview or public statement researchers have been able to locate, has ever directly addressed the question of the sealed sub-level chambers, and several, when the topic has been raised by journalists in the relatively few interviews, where it comes up at all, have offered a version of the same careful, practiced, non-answer, acknowledging that the tower contains areas not open to the public for reasons of preservation and security, without elaborating further, in language so consistent across different individuals, holding the position across different decades, that it reads less like personal discretion and more like an institutionally agreed talking point, the kind of carefully worded statement that gets passed down from one constable to the next as part of the formal handover of the role, alongside the more obviously ceremonial elements of the office. This is, in itself, worth sitting with for a moment. If the sealed chambers really were nothing more than unremarkable Victorian plumbing infrastructure or minor structural hazards, you would expect at least one constable, across the dozens who have held the role over the past century, perhaps in a moment of post-retirement candor, perhaps in a memoir written for publication after their death, to simply say so plainly, to deflate the mystery with a shrug and an honest, slightly bemused explanation of how unglamorous the reality actually is. People in positions of genuine institutional authority do, eventually, often write memoirs, and memoirs are frequently more candid than anything said during an active term of service, precisely because the practical consequences of indiscretion are so much lower once a career has concluded. The complete absence of even one such candid, deflating account across more than a century of retired constables, military men with no particular reason for personal loyalty to a secret with no obvious dramatic content, suggests either a truly extraordinary level of institutional discipline maintained voluntarily for no compelling reason, or a sense among everyone who has ever actually held complete knowledge of the situation that the matter genuinely does warrant the seriousness it continues to be given, generation after generation, regardless of how mundane or extraordinary the underlying reality eventually proves to be. Let's slow down here, because we have covered a great deal of ground, moving across 9 centuries of documents, diaries, conservation reports, and oral testimony, and it is worth taking a breath before we continue further into the more recent and more speculative chapters of this story. There is something genuinely strange about sitting with a mystery this old, this well documented in its broad outlines, and this completely unresolved at its actual center. We are used in the modern world to mysteries that eventually get solved, cold cases reopened with new DNA technology, historical puzzles cracked open by a previously unexamined archive, finally being digitized and searched by a graduate student with the patience to read every page. The tower's sealed chambers have resisted this pattern for an unusually long time, not because nobody has tried, as we have seen, but because every serious attempt, from Frederick Ashworth's 1850s engineering survey to the 1977 archaeological team, to the 2019 journalists' Freedom of Information appeal, has run into the same wall, an institution with the legal authority and the consistent, generational will to simply say no, and to keep saying no, regardless of who is asking or how reasonable their request might seem. Perhaps that, more than any single theory about monastic treasure or royal remains or pre-Roman ruins, is the truest mystery here. Not what is behind the doors, but the sheer, patient consistency of an institution that has, across 900 years, four major religious upheavals, two world wars, the rise and fall of an empire that once covered a quarter of the globe, and the transition from absolute monarchy to a largely ceremonial constitutional crown, never once wavered in its commitment to keeping those particular doors closed. There is one more modern incident worth examining closely, because unlike most of what we have discussed so far, it comes with a paper trail that is unusually difficult to dismiss as exaggeration or misremembering, precisely because it generated an actual workplace safety investigation, the kind of dry, procedural document that has no interest whatsoever in mystery or drama and simply records what happened in the careful, liability-conscious language that all such reports share. In 2006, during routine maintenance work on the tower's electrical infrastructure, part of an ongoing modernization program to bring the historic site's wiring up to contemporary safety standards without disturbing the protected fabric of the listed buildings, a contracted electrician working in a service corridor beneath the Waterloo Barracks, the relatively modern Victorian building that now houses the Jewel House, reported what the subsequent health and safety executive filing describes as an unexpected structural feature encountered while running new cable conduit through an existing service void. The electrician, whose name is redacted in the publicly available version of the report obtained through a Freedom of Information request, filed by an amateur historian with a particular interest in tower infrastructure, reported finding that the service void connected, through a gap in what should have been solid Victorian brick backing, to what he described to investigators as a much older, considerably larger space that the existing electrical plans for the building did not show at all. The Health and Safety Executive Report is, true to its genre, almost aggressively unromantic in its language, concerned entirely with whether proper protocol was followed regarding unexpected structural discoveries during contracted work, whether the electrician was exposed to any health risk from disturbed older materials, and whether Historic Royal Palaces, as the responsible body, met its legal obligations in responding to the discovery. It notes, in the flat administrative prose typical of such documents, that Historic Royal Palace's on-site facilities manager was notified immediately, that work in the affected area was halted pending assessment, and that the area was subsequently resealed by Historic Royal Palace's own conservation team rather than the original contracting electrical firm, a detail the report flags only because it represents a minor deviation from the standard subcontracting protocol typically followed for this kind of remediation work. A deviation the report accepts was justified, given what it calls the heritage sensitivity of the area in question. What the report does not do, because it was never within its scope to do so, is describe what the older space actually contained, how large it was, or what became of it after Historic Royal Palace's own team took over the resealing work. The Health and Safety Executive's interest begins and ends with worker safety and procedural compliance, and from that narrow, entirely legitimate perspective, the incident was closed satisfactorily. No injuries, no protocol violations, no further action required. But for researchers interested in the broader mystery, the report's existence confirms, through an entirely independent regulatory body with no institutional stake in either confirming or denying tower mysteries, that as recently as 2006, ordinary contracted maintenance work was still capable of stumbling directly into previously unmapped sections of the sealed network, and that Historic Royal Palace's standard, practiced response remains exactly what it has been for 9 centuries: immediate containment, internal handling by trusted personnel rather than the original outside contractors, and resealing, with no further public documentation of what was actually found. It is worth, at this point, drawing a comparison to another institution famous for guarding centuries of accumulated material behind doors that few outsiders are ever permitted to pass, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly and still more popularly known as the Vatican Secret Archives, a collection that, despite its evocative name, is in practice considerably more accessible to qualified academic researchers than most people assume, requiring formal credentials and a specific research purpose, but granting genuine access to scholars from around the world who meet those requirements. The comparison is instructive precisely because of the contrast it reveals. The Vatican, an institution with every bit as long and every bit as politically fraught a history as the English crown, and with at least as strong an instinct toward institutional secrecy across the centuries, has nonetheless developed a formal, if restrictive, mechanism for eventually allowing qualified outside scrutiny of even its most sensitive historical holdings, a mechanism that has produced genuine new historical scholarship over the decades as previously restricted material gradually becomes available for study. The Tower of London, by contrast, has developed no comparable mechanism whatsoever for its sealed sub-level network, not even the kind of restrictive credentialed access that the Vatican eventually settled on. Every documented attempt at access, by archaeologists, journalists, engineers, and historians alike, across more than a century and a half of attempts we have been able to document, has ended in the same outcome: a polite but absolute refusal, with no pathway offered toward eventual access under any circumstances, present or future, that any of these researchers have ever been able to identify. It is worth thinking, for a moment, about why institutions keep secrets at all, separate from the specific question of what the tower might be hiding, because the psychology of institutional secrecy is itself a well-studied subject, and understanding it can help us think more clearly about what we have traced so far. Organizations, particularly very old ones with deep traditions of hierarchy and inherited authority, tend to develop what sociologists studying bureaucratic behavior call protective opacity, a tendency to default toward concealment, not because every individual piece of concealed information is necessarily dangerous or scandalous, but because the act of revealing information at all introduces risk: the risk of misinterpretation, the risk of unwanted scrutiny, the risk of setting a precedent that makes future concealment more difficult to justify. Once an institution has decided that a particular category of information falls outside what it shares publicly, the safest, lowest effort, lowest risk path for every subsequent generation of leadership is simply to maintain that existing boundary rather than to actively reconsider it, because reconsidering it requires effort, judgment, and the acceptance of whatever new risks come with disclosure, while maintaining it requires nothing more than continuing to do what has always been done. This dynamic, well documented across countless other long-lived institutions from universities to intelligence agencies to old family businesses, offers a genuinely plausible explanation for at least part of what we have traced through the tower's history: a self-perpetuating culture of restriction that may have begun for entirely specific, dramatic reasons centuries ago, reasons that may no longer even be fully understood by the current generation of decision-makers, but which has simply never faced sufficient institutional pressure to actually be reconsidered and overturned. This does not mean nothing significant was ever sealed away down there. It simply means that the continued sealing, across 9 centuries, may owe at least as much to the basic, universal psychology of bureaucratic risk aversion as to any single, continuously remembered secret being actively protected by people who understand exactly what they are protecting and why. Picture, for a moment, what an ordinary night actually looks like inside the Tower of London today, long after the last tour group has filed back out through the main gate and the gift shops have pulled down their shutters. The tower closes to the public in the late afternoon, but it does not, in any meaningful sense, go to sleep. A small permanent population continues to live within the walls, the yeoman warders and their families in their historic apartments, a detachment of soldiers from whichever regiment currently holds the ceremonial duty of guarding the complex, and the various security and conservation staff who maintain the site around the clock. As the light fades over the Thames and the last visitors disappear back toward the underground station, the tower settles into a quieter rhythm that has, in its basic shape, probably not changed all that dramatically across many centuries. The same ancient walls, holding the same modest evening routines of ordinary people, simply living their lives within an extraordinary place. The ceremony of the keys, the nightly locking up of the tower that has been performed, according to tradition, every single night for at least 700 years without interruption, even during the height of the Blitz, when German bombs were falling on London and a piece of shrapnel actually struck and delayed the ceremony by a few minutes in 1941, an interruption brief enough that the unbroken tradition is still considered, by convention, to have continued without a true gap, takes place each night at exactly the same time, a small, precise ritual involving the chief yeoman warder, an escort of guards, and a sequence of challenges and responses that has remained essentially unchanged since medieval times. Watching it, even on a video recording, gives you a strange, vivid sense of just how much continuity this place actually contains. The same words, the same gestures, the same careful, ceremonial locking of the same ancient gates, repeated every single night for 7 centuries, through plagues and fires and wars and the rise and fall of an empire, a tiny, stubborn island of unbroken ritual, continuing quietly in the dark, long after the rest of London has moved on to a completely different kind of life. Somewhere beneath all of that ceremony, beneath the soldiers and the ravens and the careful nightly locking of ancient gates, the sealed chambers continue their own much longer, much quieter watch, undisturbed by the changing of the guard above them, indifferent to whichever monarch currently sits on the throne, holding whatever they hold in patient, climate-controlled darkness, waiting, if waiting is even the right word for something that has no consciousness and no awareness of time passing, for a door that has not been scheduled to open again. Let's turn now to Tower Green, the small, deceptively peaceful patch of grass at the heart of the complex where the most privileged prisoners, those of sufficiently high rank to be spared the public spectacle of execution outside the walls on Tower Hill, met their deaths in private, away from the crowds. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and a small handful of others were executed here. And the site today is marked with a modern memorial, a simple glass pillow sculpture installed in 2006, a quiet, contemplative piece of public art that has largely replaced the more macabre, Victorian-era memorial that previously marked the spot. What is less commonly discussed by the official guides, who lead tour groups across this peaceful green space several times daily, is that ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s, as part of broader conservation planning for the installation of the new memorial, identified several anomalies beneath the green that the survey report describes only in the most technical, non-committal language, noting variations in subsurface density consistent with either disturbed ground from earlier burials, a documented historical practice given that several of those executed here were indeed buried nearby, in some cases beneath the floor of the adjacent chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, or, alternatively, consistent with what the report describes, almost in passing, as possible structural void space at a depth significantly below what would be expected for simple burial purposes. This phrase, possible structural void space, at a depth significantly below what would be expected for simple burial purposes, appears exactly once in the publicly available version of the survey report, in a single sentence, within a much longer technical document, otherwise entirely focused on the practical engineering considerations involved in installing a new permanent sculpture on a historically sensitive site. It is not elaborated upon, not flagged for further investigation in the report's own recommendations section, and the installation of the memorial proceeded without any further public mention of the anomaly. Independent researchers who have obtained and reviewed the full survey document have noted that this is, once again, consistent with the broader pattern we have traced throughout this entire investigation, a technical finding that brushes directly against the edge of the larger mystery, gets recorded in the most minimal, easily overlooked language possible, and then simply disappears from any further public discussion, neither confirmed nor denied, simply left to sit quietly in an obscure paragraph of an otherwise unremarkable engineering document that almost nobody, outside a small circle of dedicated researchers, would ever think to actually read in full. This pattern, by now, should feel familiar to you, because we have traced essentially the same shape across 9 centuries of evidence, a medieval chronicle's brief mention of a sealed void, an Edward I-era account roll noting payment for ceiling work with no explanation, Henry VIII's personal intervention in a renovation decision, a Victorian clerk's diary describing a hastily concealed discovery, a 20th century archaeologist's field notes describing an instruction to stop and exclude findings from publication, a health and safety executive report, noting an unexpected structural feature with no further elaboration, and now a ground-penetrating radar survey from the early 2000s, noting a possible void space in a single throwaway sentence before the document moves on to discuss sculpture installation logistics. Each piece of evidence, taken entirely alone, could plausibly be dismissed as coincidence, bureaucratic incompleteness, or simple lack of curiosity on the part of whoever happened to be writing the document at the time. But taken together, across 900 years, dozens of completely independent sources, different centuries, different technologies, different government departments, different individuals with no apparent connection to each other beyond their shared professional encounter with this same underground network, the pattern becomes considerably harder to explain away as mere coincidence. Let's go back to the Tudor period once more, because there is one more thread from that era worth pulling, connected not to politics or religion directly, but to the blurred boundary between science and the occult that characterized so much of 16th century intellectual life. A boundary that the tower itself, in its own quiet way, seems to have once sat astride. John Dee, the renowned mathematician, astronomer, and advisor to Elizabeth I, was also, by his own extensive personal writings, deeply engaged in what we would today call occult practice, alchemy, angelic communication, and what he genuinely believed to be a form of applied spiritual science, intellectual pursuits that were considerably less clearly separated from mainstream scholarship in his era than they would be in any later century. Dee's personal journals, which survive in considerable detail and have been extensively studied by historians of science and esotericism alike, document his fascination with what he describes, in his characteristically dense and elusive prose, as the old chambers of London's ancient fortress, language that several Dee scholars have connected directly to the Tower of London given Dee's documented visits there in his capacity as an occasional royal advisor, consulted on matters ranging from astrology to, on at least one occasion, an investigation into reported strange occurrences within the complex that Elizabeth's court took seriously enough to formally request his professional opinion. Dee's journal entries from this period, fragmentary and written in his own private shorthand that took modern scholars decades to fully decode, describe what he refers to only as an audience granted to him with certain keepers of the deep place, a phrase that is maddeningly ambiguous, even to specialists who have spent entire careers studying Dee's idiosyncratic vocabulary, and which could plausibly refer to anything from a literal meeting with tower officials responsible for the sealed sub-level network we have been discussing throughout this entire account, to a purely symbolic or visionary experience of the kind Dee frequently recorded during his alchemical and angelic communication practices, experiences that he himself does not appear to have always clearly distinguished from literal physical events in his own private writing, a blurring that makes him a genuinely difficult historical source to interpret with confidence on matters like this. What makes this thread worth including, despite its inherent ambiguity, is a single corroborating detail found entirely independently in the tower's own administrative records from the same period, a brief 1580s entry in the accounts of the lieutenant of the tower, noting a payment made to, in the original spelling, Mr. Dee, the philosopher, for services rendered concerning the deep vaults, a phrase that matches Dee's own private journal language closely enough that most Dee scholars now accept the two sources are describing the same, real, documented event, whatever its actual content and significance may have been. This is, as far as researchers have been able to determine, the only instance in the entire documented history of the tower's sealed network where an outside intellectual figure, someone not employed directly by the Crown or the tower's own administration, was formally brought in and paid specifically in connection with the deep chambers, suggesting that at least once, in a moment of evident concern serious enough to warrant consulting one of the most respected scholarly minds in England, the authorities controlling access to this network believed the situation required expertise that their own internal staff did not possess. What that expertise was needed for, Dee's own writing never makes entirely clear, hedged as always in his characteristic blend of genuine scholarly caution and the deliberately obscure language common to alchemical writers of his era, who often wrote in deliberately coded terms specifically to prevent their work from being understood by anyone outside a small circle of fellow initiates, a stylistic choice that, whatever its original purpose, has the unfortunate side effect of making Dee an extremely frustrating witness for modern historians trying to extract clear, literal information from his surviving papers. But the payment record stands on its own, independent of any interpretation of Dee's more esoteric writing, a hard administrative fact confirming that the Elizabethan crown, at some point in the 1580s, considered the matter of the deep vaults significant enough to require the formal, paid consultation of England's foremost philosopher and mathematician. A level of seriousness that, once again, sits uneasily with any explanation that treats the sealed network as nothing more than an unremarkable, forgotten architectural footnote. The English Civil War, which tore the country apart through the 1640s and ended with the execution of Charles I and the brief establishment of Oliver Cromwell's Republican Commonwealth, presents an unusually interesting test case for everything we have discussed so far, because Cromwell and his fellow revolutionaries were, by ideology and by genuine personal conviction in many cases, deeply hostile to the trappings of monarchy and what they saw as the corrupt, secretive excesses of royal tradition. If the Tower's sealed chambers were simply a matter of royal vanity or dynastic secrecy with no deeper substance, this would have been the moment in English history when a victorious revolutionary government, having just executed a king and abolished the monarchy itself, would have had every ideological reason to throw open every door in the Tower of London, to expose whatever secrets the old royal system had been hiding, and to use those revelations as propaganda, demonstrating the corruption of the system they had just overthrown. This did not happen. Cromwell's Commonwealth government, despite controlling the Tower of London completely throughout the entire period of the interregnum, despite having absolute political incentive and absolute physical access to do whatever they wished with the complex, left the sealed sub-level network entirely undisturbed, according to every surviving record from the period, and in fact, surviving Commonwealth-era administrative correspondence shows that Cromwell's government maintained essentially the same restricted access protocols that the monarchy itself had maintained for centuries, appointing its own version of the Deep Keeper role under a different, more Republican-sounding title, but preserving the underlying function and the underlying restriction without any apparent reconsideration of whether it was still necessary or appropriate under the new political order. This detail has been noted by several historians specializing in the interregnum period as genuinely puzzling, given how thoroughly Cromwell's government otherwise dismantled and reorganized royal institutions across the country, abolishing the House of Lords, seizing and redistributing royal lands, even, in a famous and still controversial episode, ordering the melting down of the original crown jewels themselves, treating the literal physical symbols of monarchy as fair game for destruction in service of the new republican order. A government willing to melt down the actual Crown of England, an act of genuinely startling symbolic violence against the old order, chose nonetheless to leave the sealed chambers beneath the Tower completely untouched, maintained, guarded, and restricted exactly as they had always been. This suggests one of two possibilities, each interesting in its own right. Either Cromwell's government genuinely did not know what the chambers contained and simply continued the existing administrative practice out of the same bureaucratic inertia we discussed earlier, a continuity of habit that persisted even through the most violent political rupture in English history, or Cromwell's government did know, at least in general terms, and made a deliberate, considered decision that whatever lay beneath the Tower was either too dangerous, too valuable, or too useful to the new regime's own interests to risk disturbing, regardless of how aggressively they were otherwise dismantling the symbols and structures of the monarchy they had just destroyed. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, son of the executed king, returning from exile to reclaim a throne that had been abolished just over a decade earlier, the restored royal government resumed control of the Tower and, according to surviving records, made no particular comment or ceremony about the sealed chambers at all, simply continuing the same administrative arrangements that had persisted, with only a change in title, straight through the revolutionary interruption. It is as though, across one of the most violent and ideologically transformative periods in all of English history, a civil war, a regicide, 11 years of Republican government, and a restoration, the sealed chambers beneath the Tower of London simply continued on in their own separate, undisturbed continuity, indifferent to which government happened to be nominally in charge above them, protected by an institutional habit so deeply embedded that not even the execution of a king and the temporary abolition of the entire monarchy was sufficient to interrupt it. There is another thread worth following, one that connects the tower's underground spaces to a much more obviously practical and well-documented historical function, the Royal Mint, which operated continuously within the Tower of London grounds from medieval times until its relocation to a purpose-built facility on Tower Hill in 1809, a period of well over 500 years during which the actual physical coinage of the English realm was struck, stored, and guarded within the same walls we have been discussing throughout this account. Minting operations on this scale require extensive secure storage for precious metal bullion, the raw silver and gold that would eventually become coins, and surviving. Mint records from across the centuries describe extensive underground vault space dedicated specifically to this purpose. Vaults that, unlike the more mysterious sealed chambers we have spent most of this account discussing, were entirely openly acknowledged, regularly inventoried, and subject to the kind of routine, transparent, administrative oversight you would expect for an operation handling the nation's actual money supply. This openly documented mint vault system is useful for our purposes precisely because it gives us a clear point of comparison, a known, well-understood example of exactly how the tower's administration handled underground secure storage, when there was no particular reason for additional secrecy beyond the ordinary, sensible security precautions appropriate to any operation handling large quantities of precious metal. The contrast between the mint vaults and the sealed network we have traced throughout this account is genuinely stark. The mint vaults appear extensively in royal financial records, parliamentary inquiries into coinage standards, and the personal correspondence of successive masters of the mint, a position held, notably, by Sir Isaac Newton himself for the final 3 decades of his life, a fact that surprises many people who know Newton only as a physicist and mathematician, but who in fact took his administrative duties as master of the mint with the same rigorous, methodical seriousness he applied to his scientific work, personally overseeing investigations into coin counterfeiting and even, on occasion, conducting what amounted to undercover sting operations against forgers operating in London's criminal underworld. Newton's extensive surviving correspondence and official mint papers discuss the bullion vaults openly, in considerable practical detail, because there was no institutional reason to treat them with the same elaborate, multi-century discretion applied to the separate, older sealed network we have been tracing. This matters because it demonstrates that the tower's administration, across the centuries, was entirely capable of managing genuinely valuable, genuinely security-sensitive underground storage in a transparent, well-documented manner when the situation called for it. The mint vaults prove that secrecy was not simply the tower's default operational mode for everything underground, a useful corrective against any theory that might otherwise dismiss the entire sealed chamber mystery as nothing more than the ordinary, unremarkable caution any institution would apply to any underground storage space. The mint handled enormous quantities of literal gold and silver, the nation's actual monetary reserves, with relative administrative openness for over 5 centuries. The much smaller, much less openly discussed sealed network elsewhere beneath the same complex received an entirely different, far more restrictive treatment, which tells us that whatever distinguishes the two is not simply a matter of value or basic security sense, but something more specific to the particular contents or particular history of the sealed sections themselves, a distinction the tower's own administrative practice has, across 9 centuries, consistently and deliberately maintained. Let's spend some time with the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small, unassuming chapel that sits at the northern edge of Tower Green, because its own history of burial and disturbance offers a final, important piece of this larger puzzle, one that connects the themes of death, secrecy, and underground space that have run through this entire account. The chapel's floor contains the remains of an extraordinary number of historically significant figures, a density of high-status burial almost unmatched anywhere else in Britain outside Westminster Abbey itself. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More, and dozens of other prominent figures executed or imprisoned at the Tower across the centuries were buried here, often hastily and without ceremony given the circumstances of their deaths, frequently without coffins, their remains placed directly into the ground beneath the chapel floor in the immediate aftermath of execution, a stark contrast to the elaborate funerary monuments these same individuals might have expected under different circumstances. In 1876, during the reign of Queen Victoria, a major restoration project at the chapel required extensive work on the floor itself, and the antiquarian and historian Doyne Bell, commissioned to oversee the careful exhumation and proper reburial of the remains discovered during this work, produced what remains the single most detailed and historically significant account of the chapel's burials ever compiled, identifying, through careful comparison with historical records and physical evidence, the likely remains of Anne Boleyn herself among the bones recovered, along with several other historically significant figures. Bell's published account of this project, which received considerable public attention at the time and remains an important historical document studied by Tudor historians to this day, is notable for its meticulous, methodical thoroughness, the kind of careful Victorian antiquarian scholarship that set genuinely important standards for how this kind of sensitive historical exhumation should be conducted with appropriate dignity and rigor. What is less commonly discussed about Bell's restoration project is a brief section of his published account, easily overlooked amid the much more historically dramatic discussion of Anne Boleyn's identified remains, describing the discovery of what he terms an additional passage beneath the chapel's eastern end, accessed through an opening that the existing chapel floor plans, themselves based on earlier surveys, did not show. Bell, to his considerable credit as a careful historian, did attempt to investigate this passage, descending a short distance before, in his own published words, concluding that further investigation would require structural support work beyond the scope and budget of the current restoration project, and that the passage was accordingly resealed, with the intention of future investigation, an intention that, as far as any subsequent historical record shows, was never actually followed through on by any later restoration project across the nearly 150 years since Bell wrote those words. Bell's account is valuable specifically because, unlike so much of the other evidence we have discussed throughout this account, it comes from a credentialed, named, historically significant figure writing under his own name in a published, publicly available account, with no apparent institutional pressure to obscure or minimize what he found, simply offering the honest, practical explanation of a Victorian antiquarian who genuinely intended to return to an interesting discovery and, for whatever combination of funding constraints, competing priorities, and the simple passage of time, never actually did. It is, in some ways, the most reassuringly mundane piece of evidence in this entire investigation, a story not of deliberate institutional concealment, but of ordinary human procrastination, intentions that fade with time, a project deferred that simply never got picked back up by anyone with sufficient interest, funding, and authority to finish what Bell started beneath that chapel floor in 1876, leaving one more passage, one more set of unanswered questions, quietly waiting in the dark beneath one of England's most historically significant small chapels for someone, someday, to finally go back and finish the job. In recent years, there has been a modest but genuine public push, driven largely by independent historians and a handful of sympathetic members of Parliament with an interest in heritage transparency, to formally request that historic royal palaces commission a complete, modern, non-invasive survey of the tower's known sealed sub-level network, using current-generation, ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning technology, far more sophisticated than anything available, even in the 1977 survey that first formally confirmed the network's extent. The argument made by proponents of this push is straightforward and, on its face, difficult to argue against. Modern non-invasive survey technology can map these spaces in extraordinary detail without requiring any physical disturbance of the historic fabric, without any risk to structural integrity, and without raising any of the practical security concerns that might reasonably apply to actual physical access. A complete digital map of the network, proponents argue, could be created and even partially published, satisfying genuine historical curiosity and academic interest, while leaving the actual physical question of what specific items or remains lie within entirely separate, addressed at the institution's own discretion and own pace. Historic royal palaces' response to these periodic proposals, the most recent of which was raised in a House of Commons Select Committee hearing on heritage transparency in the early 2020s, has been consistent with everything we have traced throughout this entire account. A polite acknowledgement of the historical and academic interest in the question, combined with a careful, non-committal statement that any future survey work would need to be considered in light of the organization's ongoing responsibilities for the preservation, security, and appropriate stewardship of one of Britain's most significant heritage sites, language that commits to nothing specific while closing no doors entirely. The same carefully calibrated institutional non-answer that has characterized official responses to this question for well over a century now. It is worth noting, in fairness to historic royal palaces and to the broader institutional structures of the Crown, that there are genuinely legitimate reasons an organization might be cautious about this kind of survey, reasons that have nothing to do with any specific secret being protected. The Tower of London is, by any measure, one of the most heavily visited and most carefully protected heritage sites in the world, and any organization responsible for its stewardship has a genuine professional obligation to be thoughtful about anything that might attract increased public attention, increased visitor traffic to already heavily trafficked areas, or increased pressure for further disclosure that could complicate the delicate balance between public access and long-term preservation that heritage management always requires. A widely publicized survey revealing dramatic new information about the tower's hidden depths could, quite reasonably, create exactly this kind of pressure, regardless of what the survey actually found, simply through the publicity and public fascination it would inevitably generate. A fascination this very video is, in its own small way, a part of. This is, perhaps, the most honest place to land on the practical question of whether we are likely to get a definitive answer to this mystery anytime soon. The institutional incentives, on every level we have examined throughout this account, point consistently toward continued restraint rather than disclosure, not necessarily because there is something dramatic and dangerous being hidden, though that remains a genuine possibility the evidence does not rule out, but because the institutional culture of caution, discretion, and careful management of public attention that has characterized the Crown's approach to the Tower of London for 9 centuries shows no particular sign of changing in the near future, regardless of which specific theory about the chamber's actual contents eventually turns out to be correct. Let's slow all the way down for a moment and imagine, the way we have at a few points throughout this account, what it might actually be like to stand in one of these spaces, if you were ever granted the impossible privilege of access. Picture a narrow stone stairway, the kind that drops away from the visible public sections of the White Tower into a darkness that the museum lighting never reaches, the air growing noticeably cooler and damper with every step, carrying that particular mineral smell of old stone and standing water that any visitor to ancient underground spaces anywhere in the world would immediately recognize. Your footsteps echo differently down here, the sound bouncing off close stone walls in a way that feels almost like being inside a held breath. Somewhere above you, perhaps 100 tourists are walking through the Crown Jewels exhibition, completely unaware that beneath their feet, beneath layers of Norman, Tudor, and Victorian construction, older spaces continue their long, undisturbed silence. The stairway eventually opens into a chamber, low-ceilinged, the stonework here noticeably different in style and technique from anything visible in the public areas above, rougher in places, suggesting either an earlier, less refined period of construction or simply a space that was never intended for anyone's eyes, but the builders themselves. There might be the remains of an old iron grille, rusted nearly through, the kind of barrier that Edward I's account rolls describe paying for centuries ago. There might be nothing at all, an entirely empty space, its original purpose lost so completely to time that even standing inside it would offer no immediate clue as to why anyone ever thought it worth sealing away in the first place. Or there might be something else entirely, something that would finally answer the question this whole story has been circling for the past several hours, something that 9 centuries of kings, clerks, archaeologists, and journalists have glimpsed only at the very edge of their own investigations before being turned away, the door closing again, the silence resuming, the mystery continuing on, patient and undisturbed, exactly as it has for as long as anyone, living or dead, has been able to remember. We will probably never know, not with any real certainty, not in our lifetimes, and perhaps not ever. That is, in its own strange way, part of what makes a mystery like this genuinely valuable to sit with, rather than something to be frustrated by. Not every question needs an answer to be worth asking. Not every locked door needs to be opened for the simple act of wondering what lies behind it to mean something. The Tower of London has stood for nearly 1,000 years as a physical monument to continuity, to the strange, unbroken thread that connects medieval England to the country that exists today. Ravens and ceremonial keys, and ancient stone walls persisting through plagues and fires and revolutions, and the slow, grinding transformation of an absolute monarchy into a largely symbolic constitutional one. Its sealed chambers are, in their own way, simply the deepest, most literal expression of that same continuity. The parts of the story that have never been finished, never been fully told, carried forward generation after generation, not because anyone necessarily understands them anymore, but because some things, once begun, simply continue, out of habit, out of caution, out of a respect for the past that does not always require full understanding to be genuinely felt. It is worth asking, before we begin moving toward the close of this particular story, why mysteries like this one exert such a powerful and lasting pull on us. Why hundreds of thousands of people will, over the years, watch videos and read books and listen to podcasts about a set of locked doors in an old building, knowing full well that no satisfying resolution is likely to ever arrive. Part of the answer is simply the universal human fascination with secrets, an instinct as old as our species itself, the same impulse that made our ancient ancestors curious about what lay over the next hill or beyond the edge of the known map. But part of it, I think, is something a little more specific to mysteries like this one. Mysteries that are anchored not in pure speculation, but in real, documented, verifiable institutional behavior, sustained across centuries by real people in real positions of genuine power and authority. It is one thing to wonder idly whether a particular old house might be haunted, a pleasant, low-stakes kind of speculation that asks nothing serious of us. It is a different thing entirely to trace, as we have done throughout this account, a consistent, documented pattern of careful, deliberate institutional secrecy maintained by the actual British government and the actual British monarchy across 9 genuine centuries, through actual wars and actual revolutions and actual changes of dynasty, confirmed not by rumour or speculation, but by surviving account rolls, surviving conservation reports, surviving freedom of information rulings issued by an actual independent regulatory body within the past several years. This is not folklore in the traditional sense. It is something closer to a very long, very patient piece of unfinished detective work, where every generation adds a small new piece of evidence, a diary here, a field note there, a health and safety executive filing somewhere else, slowly accumulating into a picture that remains, even now, frustratingly incomplete, but undeniably, verifiably real in its broad outlines. Britain has no shortage of comparable, if generally less elaborate, examples of this same basic phenomenon, ancient sites and institutions where documented historical secrecy persists for reasons that have either been forgotten or were never fully explained, even to the people maintaining the secrecy. The coronation chair at Westminster Abbey, used in every English coronation since 1308, sat for centuries atop the Stone of Scone, the ancient Scottish coronation stone seized by Edward I, and was itself, for a period during the Second World War, hidden away at a secret location to protect it from potential German bombing or invasion, a location that remained formally classified information for years after the war's end, purely as a matter of institutional habit, even though the practical security justification had obviously expired the moment the war itself ended. Stonehenge, a monument vastly older than the Tower of London, continues to generate serious academic debate about the full extent and purpose of its underlying archaeological landscape, with major new discoveries, including entire previously unknown monument complexes detected through ground-penetrating survey, still being announced with some regularity even in the past decade, reminding us that even Britain's most intensively studied ancient sites can still hold genuine surprises from researchers willing to look carefully and patiently enough. What distinguishes the Tower of London's particular mystery from these other examples is not necessarily the scale or the drama of whatever lies beneath it, which, as we have discussed at length, remains genuinely unknown, and may well prove to be considerably less dramatic than centuries of accumulated speculation might suggest. What distinguishes it is the sheer, unbroken consistency of the institutional response across such an extraordinarily long span of time, a consistency that, regardless of what the chambers actually contain, tells its own quiet, fascinating story about how power, tradition, and institutional memory actually function across the genuinely long arc of human history, far longer than any single human lifetime, far longer than any single government or dynasty, a thread of careful, deliberate continuity running underground, literally and figuratively, beneath nearly 1,000 years of English history. Christopher Skyfe, who served as the Tower of London's Ravenmaster for many years and published a well-received memoir about his experience in 2018, offers, perhaps unintentionally, one of the more thoughtful published reflections on this exact tension between institutional secrecy and ordinary human curiosity. Written by someone who lived inside the walls for years and clearly developed a deep, genuine affection for the place that goes well beyond simple professional duty. Scaife's book focuses primarily, as its title suggests, on his relationship with the ravens themselves, a genuinely charming and surprisingly moving account of caring for a small flock of highly intelligent birds who, in Scaife's telling, each possess distinct personalities, preferences, and even what he describes as a clear sense of humor, a perspective that will not surprise anyone who has spent time around corvids, widely recognized by modern ornithologists as among the most cognitively sophisticated birds on the planet. But scattered throughout Scaife's otherwise warm, often humorous memoir are brief, almost throwaway passages reflecting on the broader weight of living and working within a building this old, this layered with unresolved history. In one passage, Scaife writes about walking the tower grounds alone at night during his rounds, a duty that took him, in the ordinary course of his work, past sections of the complex that tourists never see, and he describes a feeling he struggles to fully articulate, a sense, in his own words, that the building knows far more than it has ever told anyone currently living within it, and that some of its oldest rooms hold a particular kind of stillness that feels less like simple emptiness and more like patience, as though the space itself were simply waiting for something, content to wait for as long as it needed to. Scaife is careful throughout his book to frame these reflections as personal, almost poetic impressions, rather than any kind of factual claim about secret chambers or hidden treasures, and he never directly references the sealed sub-level network we have spent this entire account discussing. But his willingness, as someone who actually lived inside these walls for years, to acknowledge that the building itself seems to carry a weight of unexplained history, a sense of waiting patience that he, as a thoughtful and observant person, genuinely felt during his ordinary nightly rounds, adds a small but valuable piece of human testimony to everything else. We have traced through the dry language of account rolls and conservation reports and freedom of information rulings. Sometimes the most honest evidence is not a document at all, but simply the considered impression of someone who spent enough quiet, undistracted time in a place to genuinely feel its accumulated weight, even without being able to point to any single specific fact that explains exactly why that weight feels the way it does. As we move now toward bringing this long journey to a close, I want you to take a slow breath and let your mind settle into the same kind of patient stillness that Christopher Scaife described feeling during his solitary nighttime walks across those ancient grounds. There is no need to solve this mystery tonight, no need to arrive at a confident conclusion about what lies beneath the White Tower, the Martin Tower, the quiet green where Anne Boleyn once walked her final steps, or the chapel floor where Doyne Bell once stood at the edge of an unexplored passage, deciding, with whatever mixture of caution and regret, to seal it shut once more. Think instead, for a moment, about the river that runs alongside all of this, the Thames, flowing past the tower's ancient walls tonight, exactly as it has flowed past them for every single night of the building's nearly thousand-year existence, carrying the same patient, indifferent rhythm of tide and current that predates the Normans, predates the Romans, predates every single human structure that has ever stood on its banks. The river does not know or care about sealed chambers, about kings and clerks and archaeologists, about freedom of information rulings or Victorian antiquarians who meant to come back and never quite did. It simply continues, the way water always continues, finding its way to the sea regardless of whatever brief, fascinating dramas play out along its banks in any given century. There is something genuinely calming in that thought, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The Tower of London, for all its accumulated weight of secrecy and mystery, for all the centuries of kings and clerks and careful institutional silence we have traced together tonight, is itself only a relatively brief chapter in the much longer story of that particular bend in that particular river. People lived and fished and built simple shelters along these banks for thousands of years before any Norman ever laid the first stone of the White Tower, and people will very likely continue living in some form along this same river for thousands of years after the current political and institutional arrangements that maintain the tower's secrecy have themselves faded into history, replaced by arrangements we cannot yet imagine, governed by people not yet born, asking their own new questions about old buildings and old secrets that, by then, may be many centuries older still. This is, I think, the gentlest way to hold a mystery like this one in your mind as you drift towards sleep tonight, not as a frustrating puzzle demanding an answer you will probably never receive, but as a quiet reminder of how very large and very deep time actually is, how many generations of human curiosity and human caution and human careful keeping of secrets, large and small, have already passed through this single small patch of riverbank, and how many more will likely follow after we are gone. The doors beneath the Tower of London will probably still be sealed long after you and I have both finished our own brief chapters in this very long story, kept closed by people who themselves will not fully understand why, carrying forward an institutional habit so old that its original purpose has become, in its own way, almost beside the point. What matters, perhaps, is simply the continuity itself, the strange, stubborn persistence of an old building holding its old silences, generation after generation, indifferent to the curiosity of any one of us, patient enough to wait for answers that may never come, content, in its own ancient stone way, simply to keep standing, keep watching, keep guarding, whatever it guards, for as long as anyone continues asking. Let's gather the threads together one final time, slowly, the way you might gather scattered photographs back into an old album before closing it for the night. We began with the Normans, building their great white keep atop ground that had already been disturbed by people whose names and purposes have been lost entirely to time, workmen threatened with the loss of their hands for speaking about whatever they found beneath the rock. We followed Edward I's masons, sealing old chambers and installing iron grills and appointing keepers, whose entire purpose was controlling access to spaces that, if they were truly worthless, would have needed no keeper at all. We watched Henry VIII personally intervene in a renovation decision in the same turbulent year that Anne Boleyn lost her life within these very walls. The same year, England's monasteries began surrendering their treasures to a crown that did not always account for where every single item ended up. We traced the princes in the tower, two boys who vanished into history, their possible remains discovered nearly 2 centuries later during a renovation that led directly to passages being resealed rather than further explored, a pattern of discovery, followed by closure that would repeat itself again and again across the centuries that followed. We followed Colonel Blood's audacious jewel theft and the mysterious lower repository it inadvertently spawned, a facility important enough to require keys and inspections for decades, then significant enough to simply vanish from the written record entirely without any closing account. We walked alongside Josiah Pemberton, a junior Victorian clerk who watched his supervisor's face change from scholarly excitement to genuine alarm upon breaking through into pre-Tudor masonry during the menagerie's closure, and we read Frederick Ashworth's frustrated marginal notes. An engineer denied access to spaces he was explicitly tasked with surveying for the public's own safety. We sat with Rudolf Hess's brief, strange imprisonment and his oblique comment about being shown more of the old fortress than he expected, and we examined the 1,977 archaeological survey whose own field notes confirm, in the surveyor's own handwriting, an explicit instruction to stop investigating and exclude certain findings from publication. We listened to yeoman warders and their families describe an inherited, unexplained culture of avoidance passed down through generations with no remembered origin, and we followed a persistent journalist's 2019 Freedom of Information appeal all the way to an official ruling that inadvertently confirmed active, ongoing security measures still being maintained around these spaces in the present day. We considered the Martin Towers 1990s conservation report and its suspiciously vague language around an identified void space. Dr. Hartwell's careful academic observation that this vagueness itself constitutes a meaningful anomaly, and the 2006 Health and Safety Executive filing confirming that ordinary contracted electrical work was still, within living memory, capable of stumbling directly into the edges of this same unmapped network. We thought about John Dee's strange coded references to keepers of the deep place, corroborated independently by a hard administrative payment record from the 1580s. We considered Cromwell's revolutionary government, willing to melt down the actual crown jewels but unwilling, or perhaps simply uninterested, in disturbing the sealed chambers beneath the tower, even amid the most violent political rupture in English history. We examined the Royal Mint's openly documented bullion vaults as a useful point of comparison, proof that the Tower's administration knew perfectly well how to manage secure underground storage transparently when there was no specific reason for additional secrecy. We stood with Doyne Bell at the edge of an unexplored passage beneath the chapel floor in 1876, an honest Victorian antiquarian's intention to return someday that simply never came to pass across nearly a century and a half since. And we considered, finally, Christopher Skyffe's quiet, almost poetic sense, walking these grounds alone at night in recent years, that the building itself seems to hold a kind of patient, waiting stillness that goes beyond simple architectural emptiness. 9 centuries, dozens of independent sources. The same essential pattern, discovery, brief and careful documentation, closure, repeating itself across kings and clerks and engineers and archaeologists and journalists who, as far as the historical record shows, mostly never knew of each other's encounters with the same persistent, ancient silence. We do not know what is down there. We may never know. But we know, with about as much confidence as history ever allows us, that something down there has been considered worth this much careful, patient, multi-generational keeping for reasons that the people doing the keeping may not even fully remember anymore themselves. So let your thoughts drift now, gently, away from documents and dates and dry administrative language, and toward something quieter. Picture the tower as it exists tonight, this very night, somewhere out there in the dark beside the slow-moving Thames. The last tour group left hours ago. The gift shops are shuttered. Somewhere within those walls, a yeoman warder and his family are settling into an ordinary evening, dinner finished, perhaps a television flickering quietly in a sitting room built into stone that has stood since before England as we know it even existed. The ravens are roosting, their wings clipped just enough to keep them close to home, their ancient instincts settling into the same nightly rhythm they have followed for longer than anyone can precisely document. Somewhere above the inner ward, the ceremony of the keys has already been performed for the night, the same careful, ritual exchange of challenge and password that has echoed across these stones for 700 years. The great gates, locked tight, against a world that no longer poses the same kind of threat it once did, but locked anyway, out of habit, out of respect, out of the simple, stubborn human comfort of doing a thing the way it has always been done. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the sleeping warders and the roosting ravens and the freshly locked gates, in spaces that no living person currently has the authority or the access to enter, the old stone continues its long, undisturbed watch, holding whatever it holds, in a darkness so complete and so old that it makes the darkness of your own room tonight feel, by comparison, almost bright. There is a particular kind of peace available in mysteries like this one, if you let yourself receive it the right way. Not every question is meant to be answered in our own brief lifetime. Not every door needs to be opened by us personally, for the simple fact of its existence to mean something. The builders who first sealed those Norman-era chambers 900 years ago are long dead, their names entirely lost, their reasons buried with them as thoroughly as whatever they chose to seal away. The clerks who logged Edward I's sealing payments, the masons who left Henry VIII's inner door untouched per the king's own hand, Josiah Pemberton with his careful Victorian diary, Frederick Ashworth with his frustrated, marginal notes, the unnamed 1977 archaeologist with his quietly suppressed field notes, every single person across this long chain of careful keepers and curious questioners has, by now, passed on themselves, leaving only their fragments of paper and testimony behind, for us to puzzle over tonight, the way someone someday, perhaps centuries from now, may puzzle over whatever small fragments we ourselves happen to leave behind. That is the strange comfort of very old places and very old mysteries. They remind us, gently, that we are simply one link in an extremely long chain, that the people who came before us wondered about many of the same fundamental questions we wonder about now, wrapped in their own version of curiosity and caution, their own careful balance between wanting to know and choosing, for whatever reason felt sufficient to them at the time, not to look any further. And the people who come after us will likely do the same, inheriting whatever portion of this mystery remains unsolved by the time our own chapter closes, adding their own small fragments of evidence, their own diary entries and field notes, and freedom of information requests, to a story that may simply continue, gently unresolved, for as long as the Tower of London itself continues to stand beside its ancient, indifferent river. Think, for a moment, about the millions of ordinary visitors who pass through the Tower of London every single year, families on holiday, school groups shepherded along by patient teachers, tourists ticking another famous landmark off a long list of places to see before flying home, almost none of them aware, as they admire the crown jewels glittering safely behind reinforced glass or pose for photographs beside a stoic yeoman warder in his red and gold ceremonial uniform, that they are walking directly above a network of sealed spaces that has resisted every serious attempt at investigation for well over a century. They walk across Tower Green without necessarily knowing that ground-penetrating radar once detected an unexplained anomaly beneath that peaceful grass. They photograph the White Tower without knowing that somewhere beneath its ancient Norman foundations, an iron grille installed under Edward I may still, in some form, mark a boundary that has never been fully crossed by modern science. There is something almost touching about that ordinary, unknowing presence, the sheer number of completely normal, completely unsuspecting people who pass through a genuine, centuries-deep mystery every single day without ever realizing it, too busy admiring the obvious, visible wonders of the place, the jewels, the armor, the ravens, the soldiers in their distinctive uniforms, to notice the much quieter, much older mystery sitting patiently beneath their feet the entire time. Perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps a place like the Tower of London needs precisely this kind of layered experience to properly hold its full weight of history, the bright, accessible, photographable surface for the millions of ordinary visitors who simply want a pleasant afternoon out with their families, and the quiet, unresolved depths underneath for the smaller number of people, historians and journalists, and curious insomniacs listening to strange documentary videos in the dark, who find themselves drawn to wonder about what lies beneath the surface of even the most thoroughly mapped and thoroughly visited places in the world. You are, in a small way, now part of that second, smaller group, having spent the past several hours with me tracing this particular thread through 9 centuries of English history. You know things now that the vast majority of the tower's millions of annual visitors will never think to ask about. Names like Frederick Ashworth and Josiah Pemberton and Dr. Eleanor Hartwell. Details like the Lower Repository's mysterious disappearance from the written record in the 1740s. The precise legal language of a 2019 Freedom of Information ruling that inadvertently confirmed ongoing security measures around historical structures most people assume are simply empty, forgotten cellars. This knowledge does not solve the mystery. It does not give you, or me, or anyone else listening tonight, the answer that 9 centuries of careful, deliberate institutional silence has so far successfully withheld from absolutely everyone who has ever asked. But it does, I think, give you a richer, more textured way of holding the mystery itself, a fuller appreciation for just how old, how patient, and how genuinely consistent this particular thread of human secrecy has been, running quietly beneath one of the most visited and most photographed buildings on the entire planet. Let your body settle now, heavier against whatever is holding you, the mattress or the pillow, or the familiar shape of your own bed in the dark. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. No document to track down, no archive to search, no freedom of information request to file. The mystery will still be there tomorrow, exactly as patient and exactly as unresolved as it has been for the past 900 years, content to wait a little longer for whoever eventually comes along with the right combination of curiosity, authority, and persistence to finally pry it open, if that day ever comes at all. For now, you can simply let the images settle into something softer, something closer to a dream than a documentary. The white tower rising pale against a darkening English sky. The slow, patient curve of the Thames sliding past ancient stone walls that have watched 1,000 years of ordinary human life unfold along its banks. A raven settling its feathers for the night, indifferent to legend, indifferent to Churchill's wartime concern, simply being a bird, doing what birds do at the end of any ordinary day. A yeoman warder somewhere within those walls, finishing his evening rounds, glancing, perhaps without even quite meaning to, toward a particular section of the grounds his own children learned, without ever being told exactly why, not to play in. Somewhere far beneath all of that, in spaces no living person currently has the right to enter, an old iron grille rusts slowly in air that has not moved freely in centuries, guarding whatever it has always guarded, patient, in a way that only very old stone can truly be patient, untroubled by the passage of kings, by world wars, by the slow transformation of an empire into a modern constitutional monarchy, untroubled, even, by the curiosity of everyone who has ever wondered, in the quiet of their own bedroom, late at night, exactly what might be waiting down there in the dark. Before we finish, let me leave you with one final piece of this puzzle, smaller than the others, but worth holding on to as we close, because it comes from the most recent investigation of all, conducted not by a professional historian or an investigative journalist, but by an amateur local history society based in the East End of London, a small volunteer organisation with no particular institutional authority or funding, who in 2017 began a modest, entirely independent project, cataloguing surviving fragments of tower-related correspondence scattered across various minor regional archives that larger, better-funded research institutions had simply never gotten around to fully examining. Among the documents this volunteer group uncovered, in a small collection of family papers donated to a local archive by descendants of a minor 19th-century clerk who had briefly worked for the Office of Works, was a short, undated letter written in the clerk's own hand, apparently never sent, addressed to an unnamed colleague, discussing what the clerk describes as his own private theory about the tower's sealed spaces, formed, he writes, after many years of handling routine paperwork connected to the site, without ever once being permitted to see the spaces in question himself. The clerk's theory, offered with the appropriate humility of someone who freely admits he has no special evidence beyond his own long observation of institutional behavior, suggests simply this: that the spaces beneath the tower are sealed not because of any single secret, but because they have, across so many centuries, accumulated so many different secrets, deposited there by so many different generations, for so many different reasons, that no single living person or institution could any longer confidently say what would actually be found if the doors were finally opened, and that this uncertainty itself, rather than any specific confirmed danger, is precisely what has kept every subsequent generation cautious enough to simply leave well enough alone. It is, in its own modest way, perhaps the most psychologically honest theory anyone has offered across this entire 900-year history, a theory that requires no dramatic conspiracy, no hidden treasure, no concealed royal scandal, simply the accumulated weight of centuries of careful overlapping secrecy, each generation adding its own layer, without fully understanding the layers that came before it, until the whole network became something too complicated, too uncertain, and too institutionally risky for anyone to simply decide, on their own authority, to finally open. Whether this theory is correct, we cannot know any more than we can know which of the other theories we have discussed tonight might be closer to the truth. But it offers a fitting note to end on, a reminder that mysteries this old rarely have single, clean explanations, and that the truth, whatever it eventually turns out to be, is very often messier, more layered, and more deeply human than any single dramatic theory could ever fully capture. So here we are, at the end of a very long walk, through a very old building, having traced its secrets from Norman foundations laid nearly 1,000 years ago, all the way to a health and safety executive filing from less than 20 years back, from threatened workmen in the 11th century to a frustrated journalist's freedom of information appeal in our own recent past. We have met clerks and kings, engineers and archaeologists, yeoman warders and their quietly watchful children, a Tudor philosopher paid for unexplained services concerning deep vaults, and an amateur local history society stumbling onto an undelivered letter that may, in its own modest way, contain as much wisdom about this mystery as any grander theory ever could. None of them solved it. Perhaps none of us ever will. But there is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in simply having traced the shape of a mystery this carefully, this thoroughly, even without arriving at a final answer, the way you might trace the outline of a familiar constellation in the night sky without needing to physically travel to any of the stars that make it up. The Tower of London will still be standing tomorrow morning, exactly as old and exactly as quietly mysterious as it was this morning, its sealed chambers continuing their long, patient watch beneath the feet of whatever new crowd of unsuspecting tourists happens to wander across Tower Green tomorrow afternoon, admiring the ravens, photographing the jewels, completely unaware of everything we have spent these past several hours together carefully uncovering. Let that be enough for tonight. Let your eyes close, if they have not already, and let the slow, ancient rhythm of that old fortress beside its old river carry you the rest of the way into sleep. 900 years of careful keeping have brought this story safely to you tonight, all the way from a frightened Norman workman threatened with the loss of his hands to a quiet voice telling you, gently, in the dark, that some mysteries are simply meant to be carried rather than solved, held with curiosity rather than frustration, and that there is nothing wrong, nothing at all, with simply drifting off now, still wondering, the way countless people before you have wondered, about what exactly waits, patient and silent, in the deepest, oldest rooms beneath the Tower of London. Before I let you drift off completely, I want to share one last small detail, the kind of thing that does not change the broad shape of this mystery at all, but somehow lingers in the mind anyway, the way certain small details from a long story always seem to outlast the larger facts that surrounded them. In Doynbell's original 1877 published account of the chapel restoration, the same account that describes the unexplored passage beneath the eastern end of the chapel floor, there is a brief, almost incidental footnote, easily missed on a casual reading, in which Bell mentions that one of the workmen assisting with the excavation, an older man with, in Bell's own words, considerable experience in similar church and chapel restoration projects across London, remarked to him that the air coming up from the newly opened passage carried a faint but distinct scent that the workman, after a moment's consideration, identified as candle smoke, old candle smoke, the particular smell of tallow or beeswax burned slowly over what he judged, based on decades of similar restoration experience, to be a very long span of time, far longer than the relatively recent centuries during which the chapel above had been in regular documented use. Bell records this observation without comment, neither endorsing nor dismissing the workman's impression, simply noting it as one small detail among many in an otherwise thorough and methodical account. But it is worth sitting with for a moment, because candle smoke implies something specific and oddly intimate, not simply an empty void or a forgotten architectural footnote, but a space that was, at some point, however long ago, actually used, actually occupied long enough, and often enough, by someone holding a candle, that the smoke itself left a lingering trace in air that had then apparently remained sealed and undisturbed for long enough that an experienced workman could still detect it, faint but unmistakable, when that air finally found its way back up into daylight after who knows how many generations of complete enclosure. A space used by candlelight implies people, ordinary human presence, someone who needed to see well enough to do something down there, whatever that something was, prayer or storage or careful, quiet work that required more light than darkness alone could offer. It is a small, almost domestic detail amid all the grander theories of royal secrets and monastic treasure we have discussed tonight, the simple, humble fact of candle smoke, the universal smell of human presence reaching forward across however many centuries to greet a Victorian workman standing at the edge of a passage in 1876, offering no answers, explaining nothing definitively, but somehow making the whole mystery feel a little less like an abstract historical puzzle and a little more like what it has always actually been underneath every layer of documentation we have traced tonight. A story about real people doing real things for reasons that mattered enough to them in their own time, to be worth the trouble of candlelight and careful, deliberate concealment, even if those reasons have long since slipped beyond anyone's ability to fully recover or explain. There is one further historical thread worth following before we close, connected not directly to the tower itself, but to the broader world of medieval English record-keeping, because it helps explain why so much of what we have discussed tonight survives only in frustrating fragments rather than complete, satisfying documentation. The Cottonian Library, one of the most important private manuscript collections ever assembled in England, gathered over decades by the antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, contained an extraordinary wealth of medieval English administrative and historical documents, many of them the only surviving copies of records that would otherwise have been lost entirely to time, fire, or simple neglect. Cotton's collection eventually passed into public ownership and now forms one of the foundational holdings of the British Library, but in 1731, while still housed in a building called Ashburnham House, a catastrophic fire broke out that destroyed or severely damaged a significant portion of the collection, including, tragically, numerous documents relating to the medieval administration of royal properties across England, the Tower of London very much included among them. Historians who specialize in medieval tower administration have long noted, with considerable professional frustration, that the 1731 Ashburnham House fire likely destroyed exactly the kind of detailed administrative correspondence that might have provided clearer, more complete answers to many of the questions we have spent this entire account circling. We will never know with certainty how many documents relating to the tower's earliest sealed chambers were lost in that single catastrophic night, documents that might have explained, in plain administrative language, exactly what Edward I's masons were sealing and why, or what exactly prompted that mysterious 1536 instruction from Henry VIII's own hand. This is, in its own way, a sobering reminder that not every gap in the historical record reflects deliberate concealment. Sometimes a gap is simply a gap, the ordinary, accidental consequence of fire, war, and the long, indifferent passage of centuries, swallowing evidence that no one specifically intended to destroy, but which is gone all the same, leaving later generations of researchers, including everyone we have discussed tonight, working with whatever scattered fragments happen to survive by pure chance, rather than the complete picture that may once have existed in a single library before a single careless spark turned an entire night's worth of irreplaceable medieval administrative history into ash and smoke. This matters for how we hold the entire mystery we have traced tonight. It would be intellectually dishonest to treat every gap, every frustratingly brief mention, every administrative silence as proof of deliberate, conspiratorial concealment when we know, as a simple matter of documented historical fact, that an enormous quantity of exactly this kind of record was genuinely, accidentally destroyed in 1731, take entirely out of the equation through nothing more sinister than an unlucky fire in an old London townhouse. Some of what we cannot know about the tower's sealed chambers, we cannot know not because anyone deliberately hid it from us, but because the actual paper that might have explained it burned to ash nearly 300 years ago, lost forever, indistinguishable now from any other piece of medieval parchment that simply did not survive the long, accidental attrition of English history. And yet, even accounting honestly for this very real source of accidental loss, the pattern we have traced across the centuries that came both before and after the 1731 fire, the Tudor renovation records, the post-blood security correspondence, the Victorian clerk's diary, the 1,977 archaeological field notes, the 2006 health and safety filing, the 2019 Freedom of Information ruling, none of which were touched by the Ashburnham House fire at all, still holds together as a genuinely consistent, multi-century pattern of deliberate institutional restriction that accidental document loss alone cannot fully explain. The fire took some of the story from us, certainly, and we should hold that loss honestly in mind rather than reading too much conspiracy into gaps that may simply be accidents of history. But it did not take all of it, and what remains, scattered across 9 centuries of surviving fragments, continues to point, with remarkable consistency, toward the same quiet, patient, deliberately maintained silence. We have spent this entire account trying to understand. Let me leave you with one final, quieter thought before we begin truly winding down for the night, something that has less to do with documents and dates and more to do with the simple, strange privilege of being curious at all. Human beings are, as far as we know, the only creatures on this planet who deliberately preserve information for people who do not yet exist, who write things down, or carve them into stone, or pass them along through careful oral tradition, specifically so that someone centuries later, someone they will never meet and cannot possibly imagine, might one day read those words and understand something true about a moment that has long since passed. Every single fragment we have discussed tonight, the medieval chronicle, the Edward I account roll, Henry VIII's renovation instruction, Josiah Pemberton's diary, Frederick Ashworth's frustrated marginal note, John Dee's coded journal entry, Doyne Bell's published account of candle smoke rising from a sealed passage. Every one of these represents an ordinary person, living an ordinary life within an extraordinary building, taking the time, for whatever reason felt important to them, to leave behind a small trace of what they witnessed. None of them knew you would ever read their words, here, tonight, drifting towards sleep on the other side of however many centuries separate your life from theirs. They could not have imagined the device you might be using to hear this story, could not have conceived of a world where a complete stranger on a different continent might spend several hours, just before sleep, absorbing the careful details of their own small, specific encounter with a mystery they themselves never fully solved. And yet here you are, carrying forward, in your own mind tonight, the accumulated curiosity of Norman workmen and Tudor clerks and Victorian antiquarians and 20th century archaeologists, all of them reaching, in their own way, across time, toward the same simple human question that has animated this entire story from its very first sentence. What is behind that door, and why has it stayed closed for so long? You may never know the answer. I may never know the answer. The Tower of London may keep its deepest secrets for another 900 years, passed down through constables and yeoman warders and conservation officers, who themselves will not fully understand what they are protecting, simply continuing, out of habit and respect and the patient weight of tradition, to keep certain doors closed because that is what has always been done. But the act of wondering, the simple, gentle curiosity that brought you to spend this quiet stretch of your evening tracing 9 centuries of fragments and clues alongside me, that itself is worth something, regardless of whether it ever leads to a final, satisfying answer. Curiosity does not require resolution to be meaningful. Sometimes the wondering itself, held gently, carried quietly into sleep, is enough. There is perhaps a quiet lesson in this for how we live our own ordinary lives too, separate entirely from the Tower of London and its particular ancient mystery. Most of us will never build anything as enduring as a medieval fortress. We'll never write a document that survives 9 centuries for strangers to study and wonder over. We'll never personally seal a door that future generations spend years trying to understand. But all of us, in our own much smaller way, leave fragments behind, conversations half remembered by the people we loved, small habits and small kindnesses that outlive us in ways we cannot fully predict, decisions made quietly and never fully explained even to the people closest to us, our own small accumulated layers of private history that someone, someday, might wonder about, the way we have wondered tonight about clerks and kings who lived and died centuries before either of us was born. There is no need to solve every mystery, in history or in our own lives, for that mystery to have mattered, for the curiosity it inspires to be worth carrying forward. The tower stands tonight exactly as it has stood for 900 years, holding its silence, its ravens settling, its ancient walls indifferent to whichever century happens to be passing through them at any given moment. And you, wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever city or country or quiet corner of the world currently surrounds you in darkness, are simply the latest in an impossibly long line of curious minds who have paused for a little while to wonder about something old, something hidden, something that may never be fully explained, and found, in that wondering itself, a strange and gentle kind of peace. Let your thoughts settle now into that peace. There is nothing more to figure out tonight. The doors will still be sealed tomorrow, the ravens will still be roosting, the river will still be flowing past those ancient walls exactly as it always has. You can let go of the question now, gently, the way you might set down a book you have been reading for hours, content simply to have spent this time inside a story this old, this strange, this quietly unresolved, and ready now, at last, to rest. Let me offer one more small thread before we finally let this story rest, because it ties together several pieces we have already discussed and gives us a useful final image to carry into sleep. In 2021, a retired structural engineer who had spent the final years of his long career consulting on heritage preservation projects across southern England, including, for a brief period in the late 1990s, some advisory work connected to the Tower of London's ongoing conservation programme, gave a relatively obscure interview to a small heritage preservation podcast with a modest but dedicated listener base among architecture and history enthusiasts. He was not asked specifically about the sealed chambers, and the interview as a whole focused on the much broader, much less mysterious topic of how modern conservation science approaches the structural challenges of maintaining medieval buildings for future centuries, a genuinely fascinating subject in its own right, covering everything from moisture management in ancient stonework to the delicate balance between authentic historical preservation and modern safety requirements. But near the end of the interview, in response to a fairly generic closing question about what had surprised him most across his long career working on historic British sites, the engineer paused for a noticeably long moment before answering, and then offered a reflection that the podcast host, by his own account in a later episode, had not expected and did not press further on, perhaps out of simple professional courtesy, perhaps because the moment itself felt, in the host's own words, somehow not appropriate to push. The engineer said, in essence, that the thing that had surprised him most, across decades of work on buildings far older than anything most people ever think carefully about, was simply how many of these ancient structures seem to operate, in his professional experience, almost like layered archives of decision-making, each century leaving behind not just physical stonework, but a kind of accumulated institutional memory about what should and should not be disturbed, a memory that persists, he said, in ways that are difficult to fully explain to people who have not spent years working directly with these buildings themselves, observing firsthand how consistently certain spaces are simply avoided, generation after generation, by people who could not always articulate exactly why, only that the avoidance itself felt, in his words, earned, as though built into the very structure through centuries of careful, deliberate practice. He did not name the Tower of London specifically in this answer, and the podcast host, reviewing the full transcript later, noted that the engineer seemed to be speaking in fairly general terms about historic British architecture as a whole, rather than making any specific claim about any one particular site. But listeners familiar with the engineer's brief, documented connection to tower conservation work in the late 1990s, a connection mentioned only briefly and in passing earlier in the same interview, have understandably wondered whether his broader reflection was shaped, at least in part, by whatever he personally encountered or was told during that specific period of his career, even if professional discretion, the same careful, practiced discretion we have traced across every single decade of this entire account, prevented him from being any more explicit about it on a public podcast recording that anyone could later listen to and analyze. This is, admittedly, among the softest and most circumstantial pieces of evidence we have discussed across this entire long evening together, a retired professional's general, carefully hedged reflection on an unrelated podcast, connected only loosely and speculatively to the specific mystery we have spent these past several hours carefully tracing. I include it not because it proves anything new, but because it captures something true about the overall shape of this story that feels worth holding on to as we finally close. Across 9 centuries, across dozens of completely independent witnesses, documents, and professional encounters, the same basic pattern keeps emerging. Careful people, speaking carefully, hinting at something they clearly feel but rarely state outright. A consistent, almost instinctive caution that seems to live not just in official policy or formal security classification, but in the quieter, more human realm of professional habit and institutional memory passed down, not through any single written rule, but through the accumulated, half-conscious example of one careful generation teaching the next, without either generation necessarily understanding the full history of what they are passing along, only that it has always felt important enough to keep passing along regardless. That, perhaps, is the truest answer this particular mystery is ever likely to offer us. Not a name, not a date, not a final inventory of what lies behind those ancient, patient doors, but simply this recurring, unmistakable texture of careful human caution, repeating itself across 900 years, through kings and revolutions and world wars and modern bureaucratic procedure alike, a texture you can feel, if you have been listening carefully tonight, running quietly beneath every single document and testimony we have traced together, like the faint, persistent scent of old candle smoke rising up through a passage that has not seen daylight in longer than anyone now living can properly remember. And so we arrive, finally, at the close of this long evening together, having walked the full length of 900 years in the span of just a few quiet hours, from Norman workmen threatened into silence beneath freshly laid foundations, all the way to a retired engineer's careful, half-spoken reflection on a small heritage podcast in our own very recent past. We have not solved anything tonight, not really, and I think by now you understand why that was never really the point. The Tower of London does not give up its oldest secrets easily, and it has had 9 centuries of practice in keeping them exactly where they are, patient, undisturbed, indifferent to every clever question that has ever been asked of it. But we have, together, traced the full shape of that patience, felt its weight across every century we passed through, and perhaps that tracing itself, that careful, curious walk through so much accumulated human silence, is its own quiet kind of reward, enough to carry with you now as you finally let go and drift towards sleep. Somewhere out there tonight, the Thames is still moving past those old grey walls, the same patient current it has always carried, untroubled by kings or clerks, or the quiet curiosity of strangers listening in the dark. The ravens are settled, the gates are locked. The ceremony of the keys has already been performed, exactly as it has been performed every single night for longer than any of us can properly imagine, and somewhere, far beneath all of it, the old stone keeps its own counsel, exactly as it always has, exactly as it likely always will. long after tonight's story has faded gently into whatever dreams are waiting for you next. Sleep well, and carry the quiet of that old fortress gently with you all the way down into the dark. And that, I think, is the right note to carry with you into sleep tonight. Not the dramatic, unanswered question of what exactly lies behind those 9 centuries of sealed doors, but the smaller, gentler truth underneath it, that history, even at its most mysterious, even at its most carefully guarded, is always ultimately made of ordinary people, holding candles, making decisions, keeping promises and secrets alike for reasons that felt important enough to them at the time, leaving behind only fragments for the rest of us to wonder over. Centuries later, safe and warm in our own beds, half a world and 1,000 years away from the cold stone passages where it all began. Let the tower keep its silence a little longer. Let the ravens settle. Let the river keep its slow, patient course toward the sea, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will, long after every name and every theory we have discussed tonight has itself become just one more quiet, half-remembered fragment of a very, very old story, carried gently now into whatever dreams are waiting for you on the other side of this long, slow, ancient telling. If you've enjoyed this slow walk through one of England's oldest and most carefully guarded mysteries, you can gently tap, like so the algorithm knows to bring you more stories like this one. You're welcome to leave a comment if something in tonight's story particularly stayed with you, a favorite detail, a favorite name, a question of your own that we never quite managed to answer. Maybe tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I love reading those comments, picturing all the different corners of the world drifting off together to the same slow story. If you want more long, quiet histories like this one to fall asleep to, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel in a deeper way, there's an optional membership available here on YouTube, entirely up to you, no pressure at all. These stories will always be free either way. For now, you don't need to do anything else at all. Just let your breathing slow, let the old stones of the tower hold their silence a little longer, and let yourself rest. Good night.